Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my heart was pounding violently in my ears as panic infused my blood with its nauseous icy cocktail of terror on the rocks. I ran down the sweeping staircase of our semi-detached cottage-style double-storey home, finding to my absolute horror that the front door had been left wide open. How had that happened? I was certain I had locked it after my husband had driven off. Merrill had been upstairs in the bedroom only a minute ago. Only a minute, but that is all it requires. A fleeting second of an intrusive distraction is all it takes for your worst nightmare to come to its consummate fruition. With the bright red front door left wide open, she could be anywhere by now. Supposing she had gone out onto the street. I called out to my daughter, my heart strangled by fear, my chest tight with apprehension, my mind soaked in an infusion of trepidation. Merrill! Merrill! Merrill, where are you? I ran through all the downstairs rooms, calling out my 4-year-old daughter's name, but to no avail. There was no answer to my frantic, frenzied, desperate calls, only the sound of the inauspicious sound of silence, along with the purring sound of the kettle boiling. No, please, God, no, I cried. This can't be happening to me. It can't be happening to me. Panic-stricken, I ran out onto the street. It was early morning here in the smaller North American rural town where I lived. People were not yet up. The only reason I'd got up early was my husband needed to leave before the crack of dawn to catch a commuter train for an all-important meeting. I had bustled around our kitchen, making him coffee, along with a light snack to see him on his way. Merrill was a light sleeper. She'd got up to play with her Barbie dolls. That was what she'd been doing very happily only moments ago, before she had vanished off the face of the earth, in the upstairs bedroom. She had woken up early, sensing the unusual hive of activity, wanting to align herself with the bustle of it. She had subsequently spontaneously climbed out of bed in an ebullient, joyful mood. Mummy, Barbie's going to wear her pink coat this morning and her white skirt, 'cause just like Daddy, she's got a very important meeting that she needs to get to very soon. She has to hurry like Daddy does. That's very nice, dear, I had said, giving her a big kiss on her chubby little cheeks. She had looked up at me adoringly with her bright cornflower blue eyes, almost larger than her small, round, gorgeous baby face, with its cute little dimples around the cheeks, and a head caressed by a sea of buoyant blonde, ringleted like curls. She'd been wearing her pink Donald Duck pyjamas, and had been seen assiduously preoccupied in dressing up her Barbie doll, talking to her. We need to hurry. We've got to get very quickly. We need to get away very quickly. We can't be late. As I ran out onto our street, it was dark, with the first flickers of morning light beckoning over the horizon. The street lights with their sensors were still on. It was not light enough for them to automatically switch themselves off as they normally did. For if indeed I had not been so caught up in my feverish, frenetic panic, I would almost certainly have admired how beautiful it was outside this early in the morning, as the first cheerful chirping sounds of the dawn chorus filtered through the trees. A soft, gentle breeze was blowing. Every plant in the vicinity was gently swaying in this wind. Ostensibly, I was heartily glad that our road was a quiet place. No one was up and about, not a solitary soul in sight, not even a jogger, cyclist, or early morning dog walker. There was nothing. So surely our little Merrill was safe. She couldn't have got far on her tiny little legs. But then where was she? I'd find her in any moment. I knew I would. No, she can't have gone far. No, she can't have gone far, I kept telling myself. I glanced up and down the deep grey asphalt road, the verdant pavements lined with very large oak trees on either side of the street, that stood up majestically proud and tall, like ingenious, sharp-witted centaurians on guard duty, their green leafy boughs jiggling up and down. A cool easterly breeze blew against my face, nuzzling my cheeks gently, almost as if it was trying to reassure me that all would be well. But my anguished heart felt a gut-wrenching sense of foreboding, causing the internal muscles in my stomach to churn violently, clenching and tightening like fists opening and closing. How I wished I'd been privy to see what those oak trees might have seen moments before. The dewy fresh grass of the manicured lawns was wet as I ran up and down my street, in my slippers, pyjamas and dressing gown, looking at individual houses, front yards, and of course the road itself, in every conceivable angle that I could. She couldn't have got far. No, she couldn't have got far, I told myself repetitively, again and again, like a video recording on rewind. She couldn't have got far. No, she couldn't have got far. I could hear a truck driving down the road. I waved furiously to get its attention, but it drove away, seemingly obliviously ignorant to my internal turmoil and the despairing screams of my heart, pleading him to stop. Please, stop! Someone must have seen something, surely. But then who? There wasn't a solitary soul in sight. Then I remembered the lake. I took my daughter to the lake very often. Her little legs never struggled to get there. It wasn't far. Oh, my God, the lake! My daughter loved that lake. It was her quintessential favourite spot in the entire world. We always went to visit the lake to feed the ducks. My mind was tormented by that hauntingly huge body of water, the ominous, treacherous dangers it embodied. While beautiful and serene, its murky depths held many a secret. For over the years there had been a scattering of fortuitous, out-of-the-blue, random drownings in this place, not all of them children. All I could do was run towards the lake, my heart thundering violently in my chest, my pulse racing, my forehead sweating so that the hazelnut bangs in front of my face were wet from the perspiration. But there were only 3 words drumming away on the musical keyboard of my mind. God, please, no! God, please, no! God, please, no! We were fortunately privileged and ever grateful to have a large park area at the end of our street, with pristinely manicured lawns, a large silvery lake, a plethora of fabulous precipitous hiking trails, and of course hundreds of tall vertical verdant trees that sprawled out into a resplendent wood grove, stretching back for many miles. It was an idyllic haven for an abundance of wildlife of so many different species. It wasn't uncommon to see deer congregating at the lake for a morning drink or late in the evenings. It was in this serendipitous moment in time I wished with all my heart that the geographic location of this lake was anywhere else in the world except here. I was out of breath as I reached the lake. The sun was beginning to rise over the horizon, dappling the sky in a kaleidoscope of fetching golds, tangerines and pinks, almost as if an artist's paintbrush had proficiently, adeptly blended these colours into the sky to create a dazzling effect. The placid silvery lake stood perfectly still, twinkling under the early morning infusion of rising ethereal light. The ripples of water seemed undisturbed, unruffled, unsullied. Something could look perfectly innocent on its surface, couldn't it? For it wouldn't take much for a little girl to be engulfed and swallowed by the water whole, without it betraying its insidious Machiavellian secret. There was a tiny path-sized bicycle trail of asphalt that framed the outer edges of the lake, used for walkers and cyclists alike to access in a circular roundabout trip, around the broad length of the lake. I could see a cyclist in the furthest distance on the path, but they were far too far away for me to get their attention. I felt desperate helplessness, completely consumed by my fear. There was a huge lump in the back of my throat as I skimmed the whole area of the lake, with my vigilant, heedful eyes, rather like a fish-eagle, leaving no nook or cranny unchecked. But wherever I looked, there was no sight or sound of my child. It was all-consuming and daunting, because quite literally, my daughter could be anywhere. Like a yo-yo on a string, bobbing up and down in a perfect sequence. That was how I ran. Up and down, backwards and forwards, right and left, this way and that, like a headless, tormented chicken who had lost her bearings, and possibly her mind as well. I also didn't forget to examine the foliage that grew around the lake. The long rushes, the native sedges, the milkweed, the arrowheads, the cardinal flowers. Even they tormented me as they winked at me in the morning, their long thin foliage swaying evocatively, as if in their dense covering they might be concealing a heinous evil. It was as if they were whispering to me, "She could be here. She could be here." I began to cry out for my child, "Meryl! Meryl!" But my repressed words were subdued and lost, tangled by that foggy lump in the back of my throat that incited my words to sound more like a spluttering chaos of awkward, inaudible chokes. For I could barely speak. I was consumed by a numbing feeling. All of a sudden, as if by the wave of a magician's wand, it was as if a light had been switched on in the valley. In a twinkling of an eye, the world was a whole lot lighter, brighter, vivid, clearer, as everything became more visible, conspicuous, a whole lot less obscure, in the scintillating light of a brand new morning. In accordance with this unveiling of this new day, it was now honoured with a flurry of activity around the lake, which escalated significantly. A couple of young women clad in pink sweatshirts, complemented by black leggings and white sneakers, were walking briskly around the lake, as I waved them down. This seemingly mad, frantic woman in her pyjamas, oscillating her arms frantically, was not a welcoming sight for these two women, hell-bent on getting some decent exercise, not being very responsive to a seemingly unhinged stranger in her nightrobe trying to get their attention. They frowned, but they did stop. "Excuse me, have you seen a little 4-year-old girl around here?" Both the women's faces visibly softened. For a moment they registered a hint of empathy and compassion. "Sorry," they said. "No, we haven't seen her. I do hope you find her. Good luck." They proceeded along their way, increasing their pace, glancing back briefly over their shoulders to watch me. I began to run towards a man. He was walking his 2 spaniels around the lake. I waved him down. He stopped immediately, a concerned solicitude growing across his face. At least he didn't think I'd stepped out of the nut house, I thought. "Are you all right, madam?" "No, I'm not," I said, the tears cascading down my face. "I've lost my 4-year-old kid. I live up the road. I must have left the front door wide open after my husband left for work this morning. My 4-year-old has gone missing. She must have got out. I don't know what happened. I never leave that door open. I don't know where she's got to." "Have you called the police?" asked the man, taking his cell phone out of the back pocket of his khaki pants. I shook my head vigorously. "But surely I don't need to call the police yet. My daughter's got to be around here somewhere." The man ignored me as he punched 911 in his cell phone. "The name's Sean Barrow. A 4-year-old girl has gone missing. We don't know where she's got to. Unfortunately, the front door was accidentally left open. The kid got out, that's right. Her mother's frantically worried. She might have walked up to the lake. Yes, thank you." He then proceeded to give the lady at the end of the phone all my details, which I repeated to him. "Look," he said, "let me take you back home, make you a hot cup of tea. How long have you been looking for your child?" "All morning," I sighed wearily. "I've been back home hundreds of times. I've looked up and down this street over and over again. I've been all around the lake. I can find no sight or sound of her anywhere. I've looked in every nook and cranny. Supposing someone took her," I gasped, cupping my hands over my mouth. "Don't go there. It doesn't help at all," said the man kindly. "Look, let me take you home. I'll go back to my place to drop off my 2 spaniels. Then you go and put some clothes on. I'll come back to your place, make you a nice hot cup of tea, and I'll wait with you for the police to arrive. When I got home, I threw on some leggings, a sweatshirt and sneakers, and before I knew it, Sean was bustling around my kitchen making me tea, while I was trying in vain to get hold of my husband, but his cell phone was off. I felt heartily annoyed. Why, when I needed him the most, was his cell phone off? In truth, my husband tended to put his cell phone off throughout the day. He didn't appreciate being disturbed while he was working. He hated being dictated to by this little fine piece of technology that so many of us are addicted to. I was almost certain that during this quintessential important meeting he was attending, that his cell phone would be left off all day. "Don't you need to be somewhere?" I asked Sean, whom I'd seen around our neighbourhood on a plethora of occasions, but did not know him personally. "Don't you worry about me. I would very much like to help if I may. I'd like to do everything I can to help you get your child home safe and well." "Thank you. I appreciate it so much," I said, grabbing the mug he made for me, holding it thankfully in my hands, thoroughly enjoying the warmth of it, and the measure of solace that it somehow brought me. It wasn't long before 2 police officers were in my home. The day seemed to whirl by so fast, by which time Sean had gone around our entire neighbourhood, knocking on people's doors. He'd posted up pictures of my daughter, which he had attached to various trees down our road. In my book, he was even more efficient than some of the police officers. I was so glad I had inadvertently run into him. He was not only expediently helpful, but a source of invaluable encouragement and benevolent comfort to me. The officers introduced themselves to me as Officer Lisa Barker and Officer Andrew Myers. Andrew looked young for an officer, but I was struck by how attentive he was to every detail I gave him. He really rather reminded me of an owl, with his wide, learned, razor-sharp, astute eyes, studying me behind his round lenses. "Now I know, Miss Clayton, the name's Georgina," I told him. "I would prefer it if you'd call me Georgie. Georgie, I know this is very distressing, very discomposing for you. Obviously it is," he said, looking at me empathetically. "I want to assure you that 95% of kids that go missing are always found safe and well. I'm quite sure we will find your child. I've got a couple of officers on the beat knocking on doors to ask your neighbours questions and to check their backyards in case your kid wandered off. We had a time when a kid went missing. She was found in the neighbour's yard, playing on their swing set and their seesaw. Quite frankly, she could be anywhere in the neighbourhood. Now, I've got an officer right now searching the lake area as we speak. I need you to be very calm, Georgie, for the sake of your little girl. I need you to clear your mind thoroughly. Tell me everything that happened from the moment you got up this morning." The officer took his pen and paper out of his pocket. The 2 officers were now studying me, like 2 curious ravens, perching on a wicker fence, percipiently attentive and focused on my every word, as if something I might say could bring forth a fruitful conclusion to this rather perplexing conundrum of my daughter's disappearance. Well, my husband's alarm clock went off at about 4:30. He had to get up rather early. He needed to catch a commuter train. There is an all-day meeting with the company about deciding whether we should branch out into the European market or not, as there's lots of scepticism among some of the CEOs whether this would be a good move. I've been trying to get through to him on his cell, but he's not answering the phone. You see, he switches his cell phone off in important meetings. He's away for a few nights, but he always gets in touch with me. The officer nodded. "Do you know the hotel where he's staying?" "I'm sorry, I don't. I can't remember. But he will call me later. I'll find out the details later for you then." "Did you see your husband leave the house this morning?" "Of course I did. Me and Merrill waved him off. I'm certain I closed the door behind me after he'd left. That's why none of this makes any sense at all to me. You see, Merrill would never have got out of the door if it had been closed, and I close it automatically all the time." "You are sure you closed it? Do you remember hearing the click in the lock?" "I think so, but I'm not sure anymore. I'm beginning to doubt and second-guess myself. But in truth it's so instinctive, isn't it, for me to close the door behind me every time?" "Well, go on with your story, from when you woke up very early this morning." "Well, I got up to make my husband coffee. You see, he needs that caffeine boost to get him going. I wanted to make him a light snack as well, but he decided a donut was all he needed in the end. I don't really like him eating donuts first thing in the morning, but my husband has a dreadful sweet tooth. He can't help himself. Where was your daughter at this time? She was upstairs. She was waddling around in her Donald Duck pyjamas, playing with her Barbie doll. Have you got a picture of your daughter for me? The officer asked me. Of course, I said, quickly pulling out my cell phone from my sweatshirt pocket and scrolling through the photographs, picking up a close picture of my daughter feeding the ducks at the lake and smiling up at me happily through the camera. Here, I said. The officer took a photograph of my kid with his own cell phone, sending copies to everyone on the search for my child. While one officer came to the door, asking me for an item of clothing so that the tracker dogs whom had arrived at the lake would be able to see if they could discern a scent trail. I remember the horror of that piteous, poignant moment as I handed the officer an item of my precious daughter's clothing from the laundry basket. It was a yellow dress embroidered with white flowers on it that my daughter had worn the previous day. Please God, may they not find her trail by that lake, my heart begged inwardly. Now where were we? Said the officer again, stroking his chin reflectively. Now you said your daughter was playing with her Barbie doll this morning. That's right, she was. She said she needed to dress the Barbie, as the Barbie, like Daddy, needed to get to a very important meeting in a hurry. The two officers looked at each other, as if engaging in a momentary illumination of sorts. Do you think your little girl would act out her intentions as little children often do? Walk off to the pretend so-called Barbie meeting? You mean if she found the front door open, would she walk out? The officer nodded. That's exactly what I mean. Absolutely. My daughter's always wandering off. I think with the door being left wide open, she'd possibly have thought about going to the lake to feed the ducks. She'd probably have grabbed a loaf of bread, been on her merry way, without a bye or leave. She's very impulsive, an active child, forever busying herself in her fantasy make-believe world. Well, we're thoroughly searching the lake area even as I speaks, so Georgie, I can assure you of that our tracker dogs will know if your daughter's been around that lake, if they pick up her scent. Do you know, Georgie, if anyone else has a key for your front door? Could anyone else have possibly opened it this morning? No, not that I know of, with the exception of my husband, of course, but by then he'd already left. I don't know why it was left open. As I keep telling you, I'm certain I closed it after my husband left the house. Is there anyone you know of personally who's shown a particular interest in your child of late? What are you suggesting? You don't think someone has abducted her? Please don't say that. Don't scare me. Look, Georgie, I'm going through the standard police protocol, asking you all the questions I need to ask, covering all the avenues. Right now, we don't know where your daughter is. There's no need to be alarmed. We need to be open to all possibilities. Well, my husband's father did say that Meryl was a particularly pretty child, that I must take particular care of her. Watch that she didn't get abducted. He told me that you hear dreadful stories about children going missing all the time. I certainly regretted mentioning this, as my father-in-law's innocent comments had aroused a great deal of interest among the officers. It opened a can of worms, so to speak. It would seem unintentionally I had dragged the poor man into the investigation. For all intents and purposes, he was interrogated. Both my in-laws were phoning me frantically, asking me what had happened to their granddaughter. Should they fly out to stay with me? But I had reassured them that that would not be necessary. By all accounts, they were terribly upset, especially considering that they couldn't contact their son to ask him what was going on. Why does he always have to have his cell phone off? My mother-in-law complained. He's always switching that bloody thing off. Fast forward to the end of a long, hard, grueling day. A day I wish to never repeat, that would ultimately leave an indelible footprint in my mind, never to be forgotten. For it was a stressful, chaotic day, not easily forgotten. A day in which no fruitful outcome had been realized. My daughter was still missing. She could be anywhere. She could be terrified. A mother's worst nightmare, my nightmare, had come to its fruition. A day engulfed in a tsunami of dread, where one's life comes crashing down before you, like the thunderous mighty waves of a tempestuous sea, engulfing and consuming everything in its wake, with not a care in the world for the trail of shattered, devastated lives it leaves behind. A heart-wrenching day that tore at my heartstrings, robbing, pilfering, and plundering my most precious love, my beloved daughter. A day when a tenebrous darkness descended over my mind, like a cloying, suffocating fog, through which I could not see any light, for the light had been drained away, like the water being plundered down a sinkhole, gone forever, to be seen no more. My thoughts had drifted away into the ether, congesting into the black thunderclouds, brewing over the horizon, choking from a turbulent, oppressive heaviness, a mother's despair. They longed to unleash and offload. In truth, my tears I did struggle to contain, but somehow against all the odds, I couldn't afford to allow my helplessness to hijack my sanity, not when my daughter desperately needed me to hold it together. But my strength was surely waning. My internal organs were not unaffected by this gruesome ordeal, for indeed the digestive system of mine had gone awry. My knotted stomach was pulverized by anxiety. It was churning away like a washing machine on full throttle. I was plagued with a relentless guilt, an inflammatory self-reproach. I began blaming myself for my daughter's disappearance. If I had made absolutely certain the door was properly closed, then my daughter would not have got away. I knew the outlook could be potentially bleak, irrespective of the positive spin the police put on everything. My daughter had not been found. Neighbours' backyards had been tirelessly searched. No stone had been left unturned. No one had seen sight or sound of a 4-year-old girl. Where had she gone? The worst news was the tracker dogs had caught on to my daughter's trail, which went directly from my home to the edge of the lake, right down to where the water was. Then the trail had mysteriously vanished and ended, although one of the dogs had kept running up and down the trail that led to a woodgrove, sniffing the air as if he could smell her scent on the wind. The tracker had said the dog's behaviour was unusually bizarre. He'd never seen that behaviour before. The very congenial officer called Andrew came back to brief me, but tried to maintain a stoic, impassive expression on his face. But I was very good at discerning body language. I perceived that he ascertained, based on the dog's behaviour around the lake, that my daughter had possibly drowned, although the dogs, who usually could smell a dead body, had not tracked the scent of death. They picked up her smell in and around the water, and that was all. More unsettling, however, was that my daughter's Barbie was found floating upside down in some of the reeds, a revelation that left the hairs on the back of my neck standing on edge. Professedly, they were going to get police divers to scan the lake in the morning, and right now I was too benumbed to allow myself to think beyond the static point in the investigation, for if I dare meditate on this any more, I would almost certainly not be able to hold it together. I was barely making it already. I was crumbling at the knees like a dilapidated building, beginning to fall apart with perfunctory, slipshod foundations that were more than a little hit and miss, I'm sorry to say. The worst part of it all was no one, not even the police, had been able to get in contact with my elusive husband. Where was he? I'd got a brief SMS saying, "Love you, sweetheart. Utterly exhausted. Can't speak. Hectic day. Phone you in the morning." I didn't even have my husband's shoulders to cry on. I was all alone. That lovely, kind man, Sean, who had helped me so diligently during the course of the day, along with his charming wife, Patricia, had gone beyond the call of duty. They had generously offered to stay over at my house to keep me company, fearing that my being alone on my own would not serve my best interests favourably. I didn't agree. I wanted to be on my own. People would crowd me. I definitely needed my space. Patricia had made me a casserole that remained in its pot cold in the fridge, untouched and unconsumed. How could I possibly eat a single thing while in a state of perpetual conjecture and ambivalent incertitude, where answers to all my irresolute questions were as unforthcoming and evasive as a red fox? I knew a glass of white wine could steady my already jittering nerves. That was the only thing that could work for me. I poured myself a large glass and glugged it down, soaking in the flavours of the sweet, fragrant bouquet, allowing it to soothe my troubled soul. It appeared to be working, like a mollifying anaesthetic, as the tranquilizing effects of the alcohol ran through my veins, calming my turbulent mind, so that the feisty waves of my hopeless despair were now pacified. I was already feeling steadier on my feet, clearer in my mind. Then I heard a knocking sound at the door. At first it was so light you could believe you had imagined it, But then I heard it again. To my surprise, I opened the door to a young girl standing in the doorway. She looked strangely familiar. I'd definitely seen her around here before. "Let me in," she whispered. "It's very important." The girl walked into my entrance hall furtively. She looked around as if she was worried that I might have company with me. She asked me, "Is there anyone else here with you?" "No," I said. Relief flooded over her face. She glanced briefly at my glass of wine, with a look of longing on her face. "I wouldn't mind one of those," she asked me. I didn't care, even if she was underage. These were exceptional circumstances, after all. I poured the girl a large glass of wine, which she took gratefully from me. She made her way to my large leather couch. Like a typical teenager, she sank into it comfortably, while she pulled her legs up to her chest and rested her torso against the high rise of the couch. She began to sip the wine reflectively for a while, saying nothing, and then she surveyed me through her brown eyes. At a guess, I would say she was about 15 or 16 years old, but I couldn't be sure. She was quite pretty, with long black hair that framed a perfectly symmetrical face, bright green eyes, long lashes, and a small oval chin. "I sneaked out of the house," she told me in a whisper. "I make a habit of doing so. The parents," she said, rolling her eyes in the back of her head. "Draconian. That's the best way to describe them, I'm afraid. My dad's terribly strict. If he knew I was here, let's just say he'd have a baby." At that expression she laughed lightly, as if the idea of her dad giving birth tickled her fancy. She looked at me nervously. "I did see all your posters around town, you know. I know exactly what happened to your daughter." I gasped. "You do? You do?" She nodded. "I've got something to tell you, but I'm worried you won't believe me." Is it bad?" I asked her. "Please don't tell me it's bad." No, it's not bad. It's just, well, rather peculiar." "Go on," I said. "Right now I don't care how incongruous your story sounds. All I care about is finding my daughter. That's all that matters, after all." "Well, I sneaked out of the house early this morning for some exercise. I tend to get up very early, so no one will see me. My dad's neurotic, you see. Worries about absolutely everything. Always thinks some pervert is going to abduct me. Of course, with your daughter's posters around town, this evening he was even more pedantic. He said to me, 'Didn't I tell you? There are horrible people in this world, doing terrible things to children.'" I grimaced when the girl said that. The young girl sighed with exasperation, rolling her eyes in the back of her head, as if her dad was the bane of her life, or a very annoying bugging mosquito that she would seriously like to swat. "Parents," she said, on a lighter note. "Who would have them, I ask you?" Anyway, where was I? Oh, yes. I was running around the lake when I saw something in the distance. At first I couldn't discern it. It did get my attention. It was like a small moving blob of white. I remember stopping and thinking that I wasn't sure what it was, but I thought it could be a little girl. I always run with my baby binoculars. I'm a very keen bird watcher, you see. If you run down some of those woodland trails, you can spot some beauties. I've actually caught sight of some rather rare birds on my runs. I focused on your daughter, realizing that it was indeed a little girl. She was all alone, without any adult supervision, and I was rather worried about her. You see, it was relatively dark outside. She appeared to be trying to reach for something in the water. Then she lost her balance and tumbled into the water. Then she seemed to sink like a stone. "My God!" I gasped. "You mean she fell into the water?" The girl nodded. So naturally I increased my running pace. I needed to get to her. But I was still a way away. Something was there long before me. It was huge, big, black. It looked like a blob at first, of something really massive. But as I got closer, I discerned it was a Bigfoot. "A Bigfoot? Are you absolutely sure about this?" I asked her. "Oh, absolutely. There is no doubt. It was a Bigfoot." "Oh, my God!" The young girl looked at me. This is the part where my story gets, well, really rather strange. Go on. "Well, the Bigfoot was terribly concerned about your poor daughter. Your daughter was howling. Her clothes and hair were sopping wet. The Bigfoot was bobbing her up and down on her, on her hips, I guess, and your daughter began to calm down significantly. She even began to twiddle the Bigfoot's hair in her hands. The Bigfoot looked directly at me. She lifted up your daughter towards me to show me, to give me a good look of her." "The Bigfoot looked at you? Showed you my daughter?" The girl nodded. Then she spoke to me in my mind. I know it sounds crazy, but she really, really did. She spoke to you in your mind? I repeated. The girl nodded. Yes, I know it sounds very absurd, but it really did happen. They weren't my thoughts. They were very different, like very distinct words that definitely weren't mine. The Bigfoot said to me in my mind, "Find me the mother. Tell her to come to the lake tonight when it's dark. I'll give her her child back. Tell her she's in good hands, not to worry. Tell her she must come to the lake on her own, or I will never bring her child back." I stared at the young girl incredulously, confounded by disbelief. Was she drunk? Was she winding me up? Was this some kind of macabre, cruel, twisted joke? Because if it was, I wasn't laughing. But the young girl eyeballed me unflinchingly through her green eyes with a sober sincerity and an earnest honesty that I could not dismiss out of hand. "You're not making this up?" The girl laughed. "Are you kidding? I've got absolutely no imagination whatsoever. My English teacher at school keeps telling me that over and over again. She complains tirelessly that my stories are pedestrian. What does she say? Pedestrian and dull. I couldn't make up an inventive, ingenious, fabricated story if I like, she keeps telling me. For a start, I never even knew Bigfoot was real. Secondly, I'm no doubt what I saw. Thirdly, I unequivocally know the creature spoke to me. Well, what can I say? She was female, she had big pillowy breasts, dark flowing hair with a bit of red in it. She was very nice, her eyes were kind. I think your kid is safe with her. I really do. You do think so? You think my daughter is safe? I do, absolutely. That Bigfoot saved your daughter's life. She would have drowned if that Bigfoot hadn't rescued her. In truth, I must confess I'm not sure I'd have been able to save her myself. I can't swim, you see. I'm rather afraid of the water. If it wasn't for that Bigfoot, your daughter would be dead, without a shadow of a doubt in my mind, but she's not. I would come with you. To the lake, I mean, but the creature insisted you went alone. I do have to ask you this. I don't want you to tell anybody about me visiting you here, or what I told you I saw. Don't involve the police or anything. Just for the record, if you do start blubbing to anyone, I will plead ignorance. Pretend I don't know what the hell you're talking about. I can't let people think I believe in Bigfoot. People will make nasty comments about me on social media. I couldn't hack that. Don't you worry. I won't involve you in any of this, I assured the girl. Thank you so much for coming. I truly appreciate it. It's only a pleasure. I just hope the Bigfoot brings you back your child. She seemed honourable. Good luck. After the young girl had gone, I waited for it to get a little later. It felt like every second lasted a lifetime. I was now clinging to a hope, as if I was hanging on for dear life, a slippery cliff face, from which I would surely plummet to meet a grim outcome, if this wasn't true. I wanted to believe with all my heart that my little daughter was in the safe hands of an ambiguous Bigfoot. Or was my strange visitor making this unlikely story all up? I was torn between a rock and a hard place. I was desirous to believe with all my heart that this story was intrinsically true, for indeed if it was not, then my hopes were surely dashed. Finally, when the clock on my oakwood mantel above the fireplace in our lounge struck 12, I got into my truck, driving to the parking bay at the lake, which was down the road from us. The road was deathly quiet, without a solitary soul in sight. I parked quickly, climbing out of my truck, closing the door behind me. I began to trudge around the lake with my flashlight, my heart suspended in my chest like an anticipatory balloon tangled up in a tree, clawing on to the desperate hope that it would be set free to soar in the sky once again. It was an exquisitely beautiful night, smelling fragrantly fresh. I could smell wild flowers on the wind that I could not identify, with a minty lemongrass bouquet. It was dark, but the wafer-thin silvery shafts of moonlight spiralled through the velvety sky, offering a scant light which was heightened only slightly by the sparkling display of the twinkling stars. There was a still wind blowing, while the tall silhouettes of the ponderosa pines and Douglas fir trees, with their tight boughs of needles, seemed to jiggle more loosely in the wind, like stiff-necked strangers at a party, being encouraged to dance. The lake looked magnificent on this auspicious night. It sparkled and gleamed, its silvery shimmering surface caressed by the moon, as the sounds of crickets and frogs serenaded the night, offering me a measure of reassurance in their songs. In the distance I heard owl hoots, one after another, as if they were communicating with each other, and occasional shrill high-frequency whistles. They were all over, everywhere. All these years later, I affirmatively believe that it was an all-clear sound being made by a team of anomalous Bigfoots, all signalling to each other that I had indeed come alone without reinforcements. I could sense eyes on me absolutely everywhere. I discerned red eye shine all over the area as dozens of blazing pairs of eyes, all about 7 to 8 feet off the ground, were fixed on me like superglue. I knew I was being studied, scrutinized, and thoroughly observed. I could feel as if the eyes were searing through me, through my very soul. Then I saw her, moving with such an elegant grace, gliding on her huge legs towards me, almost as if she was skating on ice. On her shoulders she was carrying my daughter, who was giggling with delight, as if she was having a whale of a time, on a Ferris wheel, a roundabout, or a donkey at the fair. My daughter's tiny legs were dangling on either side of the Bigfoot's head, while the Bigfoot's overlong arms were holding my daughter's legs down upon her chest. My daughter was tugging the creature's hair like the mane of a horse. I gasped in astonishment. I realized that this creature was indeed a Bigfoot. Laugh if you like when I say she was beautiful, but she really was. Not in the conventional human way of beauty that has to meet certain ridiculous criteria in order to qualify. No, she was uniquely beautiful, in her own individualistic way, arousing in me the kind of awe and reverent admiration that I would have for a tiger or a lion. Indeed, she was magnificent. She stood up tall, proud, lofty, majestic, like a substantial tree, covered in long dark hair, with a pyramid-shaped head that was slung low upon her shoulders. She had overlong arms, a very handsome face that was so unquestionably human, bearing a remarkable resemblance to the indigenous Cherokee people. She had deep-set, dark-hooded eyes. Her eyes were so kind and beautiful. She had high cheekbones and a flat nose. I stood there in awe with the gratitude soaring in my heart, like the wings of a dove. I gasped for joy on seeing my daughter again. The Bigfoot female bent down to let my daughter get off her shoulders, but my daughter wanted to stay there. "I want another ride! I want another ride!" she cried indignantly. "I want another ride!" I impulsively grabbed my daughter off the Bigfoot's shoulders, cradling her in my arms, feeling a rapturous thrill descend down my spine. I could smell her familiar scent. Needless to say, my daughter failed to share the same enthusiasm in seeing me again as I did in seeing her. All she could think about was another ride. The Bigfoot's eyes met mine. We were like two mothers united in our understanding of a mother's love. She said to me in my mind, "She's safe now. I know what it's like to lose a child." "Thank you," I said. "Thank you." The Bigfoot nodded at me, her eyes twinkling brightly. She looked happy to see me reunited with my daughter. My daughter was crying with deep regret. She certainly didn't want the Bigfoot to leave. I was astonished with her obvious attachment to the creature. I stood there watching the Bigfoot as she glided into the heart of the woods. It all seemed so surreal. I noticed one by one the red eye shine that had been fixed on me from different sets of eyes among the tall trees disappeared until they were all gone. I heard a series of owl hoots. Then all became still and serene, as if the night had never been interrupted by the presence of such incredulous, curious creatures. I was left alone, cradling my daughter by the lake, and as if on cue to celebrate our joyful reunion, the crickets and frogs that had taken a brief respite from their nightly songs started to serenade the night again. To cut a long story short, when my daughter returned home, she was right as rain. All I could get out of her was that the bear lady and her children were terribly nice. They played lots of games together and ate sweet berries. The bear pulled her out of the water after she fell into the lake to rescue her Barbie. Of course the police interviewed my daughter, but they were also told about the nice bears, so didn't quite comprehend what had happened to my daughter. I was not about to reveal the true story to them. As for my husband, I decided not to inform him about my daughter's disappearance until after he returned home. Ironically, he phoned me the very next morning, bright and early, to ask me if all was well. I told him things could not be better. I was to learn later that my husband had left his coat on the hook in the hall and quickly returned to retrieve it. He believes he possibly had not closed the door behind him. So my husband was the one who was responsible for all this drama. To this very day, I am very good friends with Sean and his wife Patricia, who offered me so much help during my search for my daughter. The girl who told me about the Bigfoot is called Tonya. We are both very good friends to this very day. To date, we have both kept our Bigfoot story secret, until now in this anonymous forum, where it is a privilege to share our story with you and your listeners. But as you can appreciate, I would like very much to leave time, places and dates off the radar. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I was casually sitting at the gleaming oak wooden table in the kitchen of my Queen Anne-style home. With its steep roof, Queen Anne-style gables, asymmetrical front facade, and expansive wraparound porch with its decorative trim, situated outside of Seattle, in a glorious green leafy neighbourhood. I was looking out of the windows that overlooked beguiling views onto my backyard, where the cherry blossom tree was now bursting with pink blossoms, while shafts of pretty early morning spring sunshine peppered the kitchen with a twinkling light. I was proud of how beautiful the yard looked, with its viridescent green lawn, along with the beds of perennial flowers, intermingled with roses, fringed in by neat little lavender hedges, along with a scattering of fruit trees. My wife Haley had been dead for over 5 years now. She had been very enchanted by our gorgeous home, along with the pretty views over the yard, the silvery pond with its glorious fountain of water that trailed down a rocky, precipitous incline to the rock pool below. I had maintained that backyard, keeping it in pristine, meticulous condition to honour her memory. My wife had loved that yard, most especially the rose garden. There wasn't a single day that went by when my heart did not ache for my beloved. How much I missed her with every fibre of my being. It was like my food was no longer salted. My life had become bland and tasteless. I never imagined how empty, futile, ineffectual, hollow and vacuous it would indeed become, without her ebullient presence in my life. It was always the little things I missed the most. The feel of my wife's warm companionship on the opposite side of the bed, the smell of fresh percolated coffee permeating the air first thing in the morning, or the sound of my wife's pretty laughter tinkling in the breeze, rather like a wind chime. Then there were times I missed coming home to find my wife dancing around the kitchen floor, joyfully waving around her wooden spoon in her hands, gyrating her hips in time to the music, singing away happily to her favourite song on the radio, all the time while staring at something attentively that smelt delicious on the gas hob. She always claimed that singing over the food blessed a meal. There were so many little things we did together that made life so rich and precious, too many things to count. Holidays, camping trips, hikes, barbecues, fine dining, theatre, and sometimes the plainest things of all, that are the most special. Now all they were just fleeting memories printed on the fabric of time, which I reviewed over and over again in my head, like a personal video recorder. I was terrified of losing touch with them. It might mean losing a part of my wife. I held on to those memories for dear life. They enabled me to feel close to her. Of course, another way I'd feel close to her was to visit her rather conspicuous, extravagant burial chamber every week at the cemetery. I'd bring a huge bouquet of flowers along with me, which I'd place in a large glass vase on the chamber. Then I'd talk to her. I'd probably gone overboard with the little monument I'd erected on her behalf, in the most beautiful, elite, esteemed part of the cemetery, under the shade of some large oak trees. I had allowed myself to be enticed by the funeral director, selling me this very lavish funeral package. I had gone for the most ostentatious monument upon which to remember my wife by. "Well, Mr. Perez, it is very good to finally meet you," the funeral director had said to me, an astute woman looking on my wife's death as a fragrant, sweet-smelling opportunity to deepen her already rather substantial pockets, as judging by the Cartier bracelets she was jangling on her wrists, she wasn't short of a bob or two. She studied me earnestly with an exaggerated look of concern in her beady brown eyes, heavily lined with black eyeliner and lashings of blue eyeshadow. "You cherished your wife so very much in life, did you not? If you've got the money, it makes perfect sense to splash out on your wife's death. I always heartily recommend a mausoleum, which is a very charming granite building. It houses the intimate, treasured space of the burial chamber. It's really quite a wonderful place to be buried. She said this as if my deceased wife would be jumping up and down for joy on the other side, about the prospect of being buried in a mausoleum. You can make sure there's a place for your personal chamber when you die as well, Mr. Perez, so you can be buried with her there. Imagine how wonderful that would be, united with your beloved wife, Mr. Perez, in death. Your body's lying to rest in such a theatrical, spectacular spot in the graveyard. When your wife sees how much you have lavished out on her financially, does it not show her what she meant to you in life? It seems pitiful to just give her a bog-standard stone, rather like the rest of the hoi polloi out there, if you know what I mean. I recommend you erect her something uniquely special with one of my designers who can help you design it. Something grandiose to honour her life. I know many of the gentlemen who have purchased mausoleums from me have been most pleased with the results, terribly happy. Why, one gentleman, Mr. Perez, was only saying to me the other day, when people see his mausoleum after he's died, they will say someone very important was buried here. I had nodded in agreement, but in reality I knew Haley hated being ostentatious. She thoroughly enjoyed living a good life, but being pretentious, frivolous and splashy with her money was never her kind of thing. I think the most extravagant thing we ever purchased in our lifetime together was in fact our Queen Anne home. I was a self-made millionaire. I could have splashed out on my wife with bountiful designer purses, expensive jewellery, but for Haley those kind of things held very little appeal. So in my heart I knew spending a fortune on a mausoleum would not have impressed her in the slightest. In truth, I really rather suspect she may have well found the whole thing rather vulgar, distasteful and salacious, but as I couldn't splash out on her any more, since she'd been taken away from me so fortuitously, why not give her a great memorial, then splash out on her in death? I remember as a young boy I got a job at a graveyard, helping manage the grounds there, with regular mowing, and of course digging the grave sites for the recently departed. I recall seeing the recently bereaved widowed men and women gathering around graves, so to speak, to their lost loved one, clasping bunches of flowers in their hands, with beleaguered, melancholy expressions on their grief-stricken faces, their lives so woefully pitiful and abjectly sad. That would never be me, I thought to myself. I'd never be reduced to bringing flowers to a gravesite. After all, once you were dead, were you not? What was the point of visiting a stone memorial in a cemetery? How wrong I was, for the very sad, lonely, forsaken people that I had so pitied, I had now become. Ostensibly visiting my wife's mausoleum every week, bringing with me large bouquets of fragrant flowers to honour her memory, brought me a great measure of comfort, gave the long, lonely, drawn-out, desolate, sequestered days a measure of purpose. It would seem after Haley's unheralded death, I could discern the piteous, doleful expressions on our friends' faces. They smiled at me awkwardly when bumping into me on the high street, seemingly struggling to communicate with me. "Hello, Fred," they would say. "How are you?" "Fine," I would say. "Just fine." "Good! So glad to hear it," they would say, suddenly looking at their watches. "Oh, I'm in such a dreadful hurry. Sorry about that, Fred. I just remembered I left the rice on the hob at home. I simply must dash. So lovely to see you, Fred. All the best." I had noticed our old friends could not get away from me fast enough, as if now that I was widowed, I was somehow infected with a deadly contagious disease that they certainly didn't want to catch. How I hated those sorrowful looks they gave me. I suppose I can't blame them for feeling contrived. I mean, what did you say to someone recently bereaved? "How you doing?" when in reality you didn't want to hear the answer, in case they said, "Not good." It can make you become conspicuously aware of just how dreadfully alone and isolated you are in this world. When Haley had died, it had been so fortuitous, impetuous and unforeseen. She was not the one I thought would go first. I'd always perceived it would be the other way round. But fate can have a horrifying, macabre way of twisting things the way you don't imagine that they will go. Out of the two of us, my wife was the one as fit as a fiddle, who took care of her health. But would you believe it, she was the one that tragically died in the bath of a stroke. Haley had a sense of humour. I think she would have approved of dying in the bath. or in her rose garden, her two quintessential favourite tranquil places in the entire world. Needless to say, you never get over a haunting image of your wife's deceased body, most especially when it's an unexpected death like hers was. For me, the shock was much like a sharp knife, severing my guts. Needless to say, all Haley's clothes were still hanging in our walk-in wardrobe, 5 years on. I didn't have the heart to throw them out. I knew it was a job that needed doing. I needed to stop procrastinating, putting things off. I needed to bag them up and give them to charity, but I somehow couldn't. I couldn't get around to doing it. It felt that would be sabotage, truly letting go of her, which was something I just couldn't do. Until now, that is. For the first time in 5 years, there was a skip to my step, a hope in my heart, which was why I was smiling again. As I looked out of the backyard window, drinking my cup of coffee reflectively, even Haley's scruffy-looking Airedale black and tan terrier Rufus had noticed a change in me. He was lying on the floor attentively, his dark eyes focused on me, his square-shaped head turning to the left and right. He was studying me curiously. He knew something had become different in me in recent weeks. I was lighter and brighter in my demeanour. The overcast heaviness in my daily routines had somehow lifted. He was right about that, of course. It was true. Over the last month, my life had profoundly changed. My bleak, bland, insipid, wishy-washy-looking future was gleaming with promise. Something I'd never dared to hope for. A second chance of love was flickering on the horizon of my life, dappling my heart with a brand new hope. Suddenly Rufus began to bark. He ran to the door, his tail wagging profusely as I heard the post being jerked through the slot in the door, landing on the flagstone floor of the entrance hall with a loud thud. I walked over to the post, picking it up in my hands, skimming through it briefly. Bills, oh no, more bills. Then I saw it, a pristine large white envelope with my name and address on it, written in the most exquisite curly italic writing in black ink. On the back of the envelope there was a stylized burgundy red wax seal that had been stamped with the initial A. I tore open the envelope. I stared at the very smart white card, with its long line of curly italic writing, done in the black fountain pen. Beautiful writing, reminiscent of another time, when people wrote with such style. I stared at the sentence that was written on the card, stumbling back into the kitchen. I felt as if someone had hit me with the back of a garden trowel. As my head began to spin, I became rather unsteady on my feet. I grabbed the pot of percolated coffee, pouring myself a mug, piling it high with sugar, reading the neat writing again and again. It read, "Don't marry her. You'll end up dead like the others. She's poison. From a concerned friend." I knew without a shadow of a doubt that this card was in reference to the woman I had met only a month ago. She was already talking about wedding bells. I was naturally not adverse to the idea of marrying again, although it seemed rather over the top for a man in his 70s like myself. Still, stranger things have happened. I mean, who wants to be alone for the rest of your life? I certainly didn't. I was finding it hard enough to get through every day. I knew that Haley would never begrudge me a second chance of happiness. But this card had certainly put a spanner in the works. As somewhere deep in my gut, I knew things were too good to be true. Even before I'd read this card, there had been insidious signs that had stared at me brazenly in the face, rather like scintillating Christmas decorations that grab your attention, signs I conveniently chose to ignore. I was now beginning to wonder if I'd been set up by this woman, and I rather suspected I had. I reflected back to the first time I'd met Lily. I'd been shopping in the pet food place, ordering my usual brand of dog kibble, when out of the blue this attractive brunette, possibly in her late 50s, had come up to me, studying me curiously through long fake lashes with bright brown eyes. "Who are you buying the kibble for?" she'd asked me, standing behind me at the counter. "You're talking to me?" I had asked, looking at her in surprise. "Of course, silly," she'd laughed. "I don't see anyone else here, do you?" "No," I admitted, "I don't." She smiled at me brightly, was openly flirtatious with me, which was rather a shock, as my days of being a handsome man are well and truly over. I only have to look in the mirror to know this is true. The ravages of time have not been kind to me. In truth, I look older than my 70 years. I look rather weathered and worn, like a well-used piece of furniture that has faded from the sun. So no, I don't look like I used to. As when I was younger, I don't mind saying that I was easy on the eye. But not so any more, I'm afraid. My one redeeming feature is I am rather slender. Over the years I haven't put on a stitch of weight, but I put that down to good genetics. But I am no oil painting, I can assure you of that. So this woman flirting with me seemed a little off-kilter. Not that I wasn't enjoying the attention, of course. As what lonely old man doesn't enjoy a little fuss from a glamorous lady? "Do you have a dog?" she asked me. "Well, I wouldn't be buying dog food if I didn't," I had said. She had laughed a bright musical laugh, flashing her long fake eyelashes at me suggestively, playing with the pretty pendant on her breastbone. "I have an Airedale. It belonged to my late wife. His name is Rufus. He's a very nice character, actually. Rather an agreeable temperament, I have to say." "Oh, my God! You have an Airedale! Oh, I love Airedales! Please, can I come and visit your dog? I hope it's not presumptuous of me to ask you, but I just have a big passion for Airedales. Living in an apartment like I do, I don't get to keep a big dog. My name's Lily Peterson, by the way." "And I'm Freddie Montague," I told her. At Lily's spontaneous, serendipitous request, I'd been quite startled by her enthusiasm. It had been infectious, so I'd invited her over to tea. When she arrived at my home, let's just say she didn't give Rufus, my Airedale, a fleeting glance, which I thought was decidedly odd. I mean, she was here to see my Airedale, was she not? But she showed him as much interest as a horse would have if a chef offered him a braised piece of fillet steak instead of an apple. I should have seen the warning red flags blowing in the wind right then and there, but I didn't. "This is Rufus," I had told her. "Oh, he's lovely," she had said, in an impassioned, insouciant, perfunctory voice. I noticed that her nose physically wrinkled up in disgust, as if in reality she was one of those people that secretly rather despised dogs. She promptly disregarded Rufus, who began to growl at her. I hasten to say he has never done before. His dislike towards Lily was instantaneous. Needless to say, Lily seduced me in a way that no woman has ever done so before, with a pronounced expertise that perhaps was more professional than personal. Let's just say the movie 9.5 Weeks would have done well to take some pointers from Lily, for she was full on in the bedroom department, which was rather overwhelming for a man like me, because let's just say I've never exactly been the wild, adventurous type. Frankly, it's too exhausting for me, especially at my age. And so began 4 weeks of wining and dining Lily at some of Seattle's most exclusive restaurants, places like the Pink Door, the Art of the Table, the Nest, and Ascen's Prime Steak and Sushi, all fabulously expensive restaurants. I'd also taken her shopping, bought her designer purses and clothes. Lily loved all things deluxe, fashionable, luxurious and posh. "Oh, you are such a sweetheart, Freddie dear," she had said to me, kissing both sides of my cheeks affectionately. "Aren't I such a lucky girl?" she would say to the shop assistant behind the till. "You are indeed, madam," the lady would say, smiling at her, handing her back a small designer carrier bag, with a big smile on her face. "They don't make them like him any more, do they?" Lily had said, winking at the sales assistant, and tottering off with a big swagger, like a cat who'd got the cream, and then some. When I went out for dinner with Lily, she smiled at me, layering me with a plethora of charm. One thing I always discerned without exception is that her smile never met her eyes. I began to secretly ponder if Lily was only interested in me for my deep pockets. But then I'd never revealed to her that I was a man of sizable means. But there were ways she could have found out. For indeed my Queen Anne home was of course an expedient asset. It was very bodaciously decorated to complement the historic integrity of the home, where no expense had been spared. However, the modest way that me and Haley had lived our lives never suggested for a single moment that we were affluent. However, these days there were, as I was saying, ways and means to find out whether someone was sitting on a hefty nest egg. But even the Queen Anne home on its own was worth a sizable amount of money. I asked myself that even if Lily was only interested in me for my money, was that such a bad thing? I'm sure hundreds of men had married women that were only attracted to their affluence, and they hadn't even batted an eyelid about it. I mean, if I married Lily, it would mean not being alone. As far as I was concerned, that was a big plus, but being played was not something that I could easily condone. I sensed in my gut that Lily was playing with me, which left a bitter taste in my mouth that I couldn't easily eradicate. Lily may have been attractive, but she was a woman with a rather hard face. She looked like a person who hadn't had life very easily. On a subconscious level, I think she was mad at the world about the unfairness of her lot, for she had admitted to me that she had come from an impoverished background, had been abused by her father when she was a young girl, so there was no doubt in my mind that she was damaged goods, had a vendetta with the world. I remember her saying, "I've had to work damned hard for anything I've ever wanted in my life." She'd said this with an angry edge to her voice. It got the hair on the back of my neck standing on edge, I don't mind admitting. I could see by the glamorous outfit she threw together, along with her heavily made-up face, literally suffocated by layers of thick makeup, that she was trying her best to be very glamorous. She was always preened within an inch of her life, with very scary, long, pink, perfectly manicured talons, regular trips to the salon for Botox and fillers, which made her forehead so fixed in place it looked as if it was made of stone, as well as frequent appointments with her stylist to touch up her grey roots, add some bonny, blonde, honey and crimson highlights to her hazelnut hair. Sometimes she looked a little like mutton dressed up as lamb, squeezing her way into tight leopard print dresses with low cleavages, all to gain maximum attention, of course, from an applauding, approving male audience. She was never disappointed. She did get the look she hankered for, so her laboured efforts to look fabulous were not unrewarded. It made me feel distinctly uncomfortable and uneasy to be with an attention-seeking woman that wanted to be admired by all and sundry, rather like a David Hockney painting on display at the Tate Gallery. I'm sure people were thinking, what is she doing with him? She could do so much better than land up with a 70-year-old man like him. I wasn't interested in Lily for her wanton advances, far from it, in fact, but she was company in my lonely life. I knew one thing without a shadow of a doubt, that my wife Haley would not have approved of her one little bit. In truth, I'm not sure I liked her either, but I enjoyed not being alone. Having someone to take out to dinner was always pleasing. Only recently, Lily had actually laid on the pressure for us to get married, when I'd asked her to move in with me. "There is no point in your going back to your apartment every day," I'd said. "Why don't you just move in with me? Come on, you know it makes a lot of sense. Besides, it'll be awfully fun if you would." She had looked up at me through her brown eyes and giggled. "I'm not that kind of girl, Freddie. I won't move in with a man until he makes an honest woman out of me. I mean, what do they say? Why buy the cow when you get the milk for free?" It seemed rather strange for her to be saying that to me, because I'd been getting far too much milk for free recently, so much so that I was beginning to feel quite nauseous. I think I was lactose intolerant. You can have too much of a good thing, I can assure you of that. "You mean you want me to marry you?" I asked her, looking rather stunned. "Now he gets it," she said, winking at me. "Oh, by the way, I've seen a fabulous engagement ring at the jeweller's on Fifth Avenue. We need not have a fancy wedding, but why don't we fly over to Vegas, get married there at the Paradise Wedding Chapel? I'll buy a beautiful dress. We can stay at the Bellagio. Go on, it'll be absolutely fabulous." I had nodded in agreement, bought her a fabulously expensive diamond rock for her finger from an exclusive jewellery store on Fifth Avenue. But as the day to fly to Las Vegas loomed ever closer, something in my gut didn't feel right about getting married to this woman. I didn't love her, and I barely even liked her. Everything about her was in your face, over the top, and while I appreciated her company, tying the knot with her was just going a step too far for me. I knew that she was a fabulous companion, but she would never ever be the love of my life like Haley had been. However, now that I was glancing at the beautifully written card, reading the ominous words again and again, "Don't marry her, or you'll end up dead like the others. She's poison, from a concerned friend," I knew that these words weren't just pie in the sky, nor someone trying to make my life miserable. These words were a sober, sincere warning from someone who knew Lily a whole lot better than I did. I mean, I'd been with Lily for only a month. I knew nothing about her at all. Things were moving way too fast. She had shown me her best face going forward, but I had seen sneaky glances at a darker side to her personality, hidden in the shadows that she managed to keep well hidden from me. Sometimes when she became inebriated, her words had grown rather careless. Her guard would slip. Then she would say things like, "You sad, pathetic old man. I'm only interested in you for your money. Why do you think I'm with you?" Of course, when she was sober, I'd confront her with her words. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," she'd say. "Of course I say anything when I'm drunk, but it means absolutely nothing at all." I wasn't so sure, for many a word of truth is spoken in jest while in the throes of a drunken frenzy. Of course I had tried to find out about Lily's past, but she was like a locked closet that refused to be opened when it came to that subject of discussion. "Oh, goodness gracious, sweetheart," she'd said, stroking my face affectionately with her long hands, unbuttoning the top button of my shirt. "You know, you do ask the most irrelevant questions that really aren't significant. So what if I have a past? So do you. But let's move on into the future, shall we? Let bygones be bygones, for goodness sake. I don't think we should dwell on our pasts. As for your late wife's closet, isn't it time you cleared up all that stuff out? Move forward into the future, Freddie, for goodness sake. And on the subject of your wife's closet, oh my goodness, she had no taste. Her clothes, oh, they're so beige, so utterly mundane, so old ladyish." "I'd rather you didn't talk about my late wife like that," I'd said. "Oh, who's getting so touchy?" she had teased. "Still got a soft spot for the old lady, have you?" she had cooed. "Oh, that's so sweet, Eddie. You're a sweet man, you really are." A day went by, and another one of those white envelopes in that black italic print arrived, once again stamped with a burgundy seal. I opened it to a note which read, "If you want to find out why you shouldn't marry Lily, I will fill you in on all the details. I'll meet you at the Mountain Lion Trail. I'll be wearing a red scarf. See you there at about 5 p.m. today. We'll go for a walk together. I will tell you everything. If you nod at me, I will know who you are." So there I was on the hiking trail, wearing a pair of white pants, a turtleneck green top, and a pair of Timberlake hiking boots, and off I went on my merry way. I decided not to take my Airedale Terrier along for the walk. I wasn't certain what to expect, or who it was that I would be meeting. I assumed it was a woman whom had known Lily in her youth, had some inside information to tell me. I had a horrible feeling whatever I was going to learn about Lily, it wasn't going to be easy on the ears. I began to walk up the precipitous, steep mountain trail that was rugged and rocky, bespeckled with feathery ferns and a plethora of Spanish moss. The day was beginning to shed its light. The forest seemed to grow dimmer. Trickles of pearly light infused through the open canopy, while parts of the sky that I could see from through open spaces had grown into a kaleidoscope of resplendent orangey yellows and tangerine colours, while the sun began to set over the valley. There was not a solitary soul on the hiking trail, but that wasn't particularly surprising, for rain had been forecast. No one wanted to be caught up in the deluge. I had come prepared with my raincoat. I could smell the rich smell of the earth, the fragrant, sweet, butterscotchy-like scents of the ponderosa pine trees, and a very distinct scent of rain on the air. The towering viridescent green ponderosa pines, Douglas firs and spruce trees were clustered together in congenial groups, almost like a large sports stadium filled with hundreds of substantial-sized wizened giants. That was when I saw a man ahead of me on the trail, wearing a bright red scarf. He nodded at me. I gave him a return nod. He waited for me to catch up with him on the trail. "I'm so glad you came. In truth, I wasn't exactly sure you would. This is my absolute favourite trail. I thoroughly enjoy walking it at the end of a long day. In spring it's spectacular, with all those colourful spring flowers. The clusters of yellow daffodils I simply love." "I agree," I said. "It is lovely." "My name is Angus," he said, reaching out to shake my hand. His handshake was strong. "I could have asked you to meet me in a bar, I know, but I'm a very outdoorsy person. I find it a lot easier to talk when I'm walking. You see, what I'm going to tell you is not going to be pleasing to hear. I decided that anyone going out with the likes of Lily needs to know what she's all about. I want you to know what you're getting yourself involved with." I realized the man was a similar age to myself, in his 70s. I would say the ravages of time had been a whole lot kinder on him, as he had a full head of hair, and seemed to be in remarkably good nick. I think he was one of those lucky, enviable men that, rather like full-bodied red wine, rather improves with age. "You're probably wondering who I am," he said. I was, rather. "What's your opinion of Lily?" he asked me. "Well, she's attractive. To be honest with you, she's not my type. She's very high maintenance, high energy, exceedingly demanding. And ruthless," Angus interjected. "That woman is ruthless. Has she asked you to go off and get married in Vegas, to book into the Bellagio or Waldorf Astoria by any chance?" "Oh, actually, yes. We're supposed to be getting married in 2 weeks' time." "Big mistake," said Angus. "Big, big mistake. You don't want that woman to get her sharp claws into you. She'll eat you alive, I can assure you of that. Tell me, Freddie, are you by any chance a lonely, wealthy widower whose wife recently died? Did you happen to get your wife buried in a mausoleum?" I looked at Angus with a dumbfounded expression on my face. "Yes. How did you know about that? I confess to being a lonely widower. My wife died 5 years ago. Yes, I was persuaded by a funeral director to get my wife buried in a mausoleum. But I will tell you this, if my wife Haley were to see her resting place, she's likely to think it is rather tacky. She would have been much happier to have a simple gravestone. She would have preferred that quite a lot, actually. Let me guess. How did you meet Lily? Was it at the supermarket or the post office or the bank?" "No. It was at a pet shop." "Let me see. Did she somehow manage to invite herself over to your place? Then she seduced you within an inch of your life?" I flushed. "Something like that. She was rather full on, I admit." "That's Lily for you. Never doing anything in half measures." "How do you know Lily?" I asked. "I'm Lily's husband number 3. I gasped. "But I don't understand. She told me she'd never been married before." "Oh, well, she's been married 5 times, if you must know. You're about to be husband number 6. "I had no idea. How did you meet her?" "Well, like you, I was a bereaved widower. Lost my wife to a long drawn-out battle with breast cancer. Sucked the dear life out of me, it did. But I loved that woman with all my heart. Well, I went to the local cemetery. I was persuaded to get my wife buried in a mausoleum, because if you're a man of means, that's an appropriate thing to do. Well, let's just say that's what the funeral director informed me. Unbeknownst to me, this funeral director was in fact Lily's sister." "You're joking." "No, I'm not. I was to discover that Lily's sister was giving her sister the men's names who had the financial means to invest in a mausoleum for their wives' departure. Then Lily was forwarded their addresses and numbers by her own sister. I believe the 2 of them are in this together, looking to target lonely old men of means like you and me." "What do you mean?" "Well, all 4 men that Lily married are now dead. They died in very suspicious, dubious circumstances. Lily cleaned them out, of course. Once they were dead, she inherited all their financial wealth and assets. She's already a rich woman in her own right, looking to get substantially richer with husband number 6, which is you." "What do you mean they died in suspicious circumstances?" I asked. "Well, I think it was husband number 1 that was drowned in the bath with sleeping pills found in his bloodstream. Lily, of course, claimed he was suffering from insomnia, took the pills, fell fast asleep in the bath, subsequently drowning. Another husband was electrocuted in the kitchen. A dreadful accident with water and electricity when the fish tank suddenly collapsed. The other husband fell to his death from a high hill on a hiking trail. But Lily, of course, was nowhere to be found when it happened. Methinks that's all too convenient. The 4th husband, well, he was found dead in his car with a gunshot to the head. But Lily was away in Reno at the time. Awfully convenient. The police haven't been able to pin anything on her. But I've made it my business to warn any of her potential suitors of her nefarious intentions. Let's just say, bro, I believe you are living on borrowed time. When you come back from your wedding in Vegas, let's just say the clock is ticking for you. How come you didn't end up killed if all her other husbands died?" I was one of the lucky ones. I happened to see that my wife's cell phone was left unlocked when she went for a shower. I discovered a whole lot of text messages between her and her sister discussing how she was going to finish me off. She came into the room with a towel around her head after her bath. When she saw me looking through her texts, her face drained of colour. She went awfully white. She grabbed her cell phone from me, smashed it into smithereens. I, of course, demanded a divorce instantly, phoning my lawyer, informing him that if I was to end up dead in nefarious, questionable circumstances, that Lily needed to be investigated forthwith. So let's just say she left me well alone, gave me my divorce, turned around to me and said, "You win some, you lose some, but I have to hand it to you, Angus, you're not as stupid as you look. It's a pity, really. I was looking forward to getting my hands on your fat bank account." I said to her, "Did you even love me?" She said to me, "Love? I've never loved anyone a day in my life. No, I don't love you." Then she stopped for a moment, as if considering my question. She looked at me and said, "Of course, there is someone I do love very much. That's me." She laughed and just sauntered off. I never saw her again. I don't know how long me and Angus engaged in conversation, but after a long walk we decided to sit down on the earthen floor and just talk. Let's just say we talked for a very long time, blindly oblivious to the marching time. I think we really hit it off, as if we'd been friends all our lives. Neither of us expected to develop such an unlikely male bonding, but we did. Angus had a torchlight with him, so we felt relatively confident about walking back in the dark, if we should need to, which was going to be the case this evening. Angus told me all about his life, how lonely he had become, how much he regretted he ever got together with Lily. He glanced briefly at his watch and said, "You're not going to believe the time, bro. It's 12 o'clock at night. You and I have not stopped talking." It had grown dark very quickly. The soft full moon permeated the canopy of the trees. Silvery shivers of light bespeckled the floor. For a long time the chorus of frogs and crickets that had serenaded the night became deathly still. Quietness swathed the entire woodgrove in carpets of silence, as everything became hauntingly still. So much so that for a while Angus and I almost became one with that silence. The only thing I can say is that I just had a sense that something was about to happen, rather like you were sitting at the theatre, waiting for the curtains to be flung open and some outrageous scene to grab your attention. It was like that for us. Then it happened, almost as if our anticipation and expectation had found its reward. We heard a sound of something very substantial moving through the trees. If we'd been in the heart of Africa, I would have said without a shadow of a doubt that a rhino was thundering in the undergrowth. Even the grunting sounds we heard aligned with the sound of a rhino. I looked at Angus and he looked at me. Our enigmatic expressions told it all. "What the heck?" we were both thinking. Then we saw them. There were two dark, tall creatures running into the woods, one after the other. When they reached the slight open clearing, where there was a sizable space between the trees, the two creatures began to fight. The way they were fighting would make Mike Tyson's performance look like a pathetic pussycat. This was some fight, where fists and legs were incorporated and thoroughly engaged. I was to realise in shock horror that these were two Bigfoots, both male. They looked completely different from each other, almost like they were altogether two unique species. I think one had the hair colour of orangutan, the face of an ape, but he was huge, his silhouette humanoid. The other was a silvery grey. I discerned the silver-grey Bigfoot had really kind, intelligent eyes, whereas the other Bigfoot looked more like an ape. He wore a murderous expression upon his face. His blazing red eyes were demoniacal, almost evil-looking. The two creatures were as polar opposite as chalk is to cheese. I am in absolutely no doubt that an encounter with the benign, benevolent creature would be pleasant, and an encounter with the ape-like one would be a very precarious encounter indeed, for he was scary, intimidating, downright nasty and vindictive. Suffice to say, the expression that eyes are the windows of the soul could not be more apt in this case, for the eyes of these Bigfoots rarely did reflect their temperaments and indeed their hearts. They fought together, and the air was infused with the most repugnant stench of sulphur that became more pronounced as they fought. The two creatures were growling at each other like very aggressive, truculent dogs. It was without question the kind of contemptible fight that left you in no doubt that this was a flagrant fight to the death. I remember saying a silent prayer for the silver Bigfoot, who I knew I liked. It was like he had an aura around him that really was beguiling. It was the ape-like humanoid that sent shivers of dread dancing down my spine like electric shocks. I truly did not like him. Finally, with one last mighty blow to the head, the gorilla-like creature finally slumped to the ground. He became lifeless. I guessed he was dead. For some unexplainable reason, both Angus and I clapped and cheered in delight with the outcome to this fight. It was such a spontaneous thing for us to do. I did not even think of the ramifications, but the silver Bigfoot glided towards us, nodded at us, as if thanking us for our applause. Then he glided away into the woods. Marcus and I were about to go and examine the deceased body. Then we heard some very substantial sounds that obviously were from another Bigfoot coming our way. We sensed it might be one of the ape-like humanoids coming to pick up his fallen comrade, so we made a quick and hasty escape. Needless to say, this incredulous event marked the eve of a long-standing friendship between me and Marcus. We are both exactly the same age. We discovered we were at school with each other in our junior years, in the same class. It's a small world indeed. We were both lonely heterosexual widows, both in love with our late wives. I suggested to Marcus, who is like a brother that I never had, that he move in with me to my Queen Anne home. I have to say the arrangements has suited us down to the ground, for at my age having companionship is what counts. As for Lily, I don't miss her at all. When I met up with her with Angus by my side at a restaurant in Seattle, Lily took one look at the two of us together, knowing her cover had been blown, and promptly disappeared from my life. I never heard from her ever again, but I recently learnt she was convicted of murdering her most recent husband, so finally the law caught up with her. She'll now be spending the rest of her life in prison. If I'm grateful for anything, it is that Lily brought her brother into my life, and a random opportunity to meet a Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Growing up in the 80s, I had a friend called Skye, who was, let's just say, as indigenous as the flowers in the meadow, as untamed as wild horses galloping across the prairies, and uncorrupted by the material interests that consumed many a young teenage girl at the time. As unlike other girls, she didn't appear to possess the same interests in pop stars, movie actors, boys, makeup and fashion, like the rest of us invariably did. Skye lived in the farm next door to mine. From the very beginning we were the best of friends. Skye was so refreshing in every way. She was like that rare flower you find in the meadow, that is so thin on the ground that you've never ever seen it before. It has procured no name for itself, as it's infrequent, uncommon, unorthodox, and exceedingly unusual. That was Skye for you. She was one of a kind. Even her parents admitted as much. I think for them Skye's idiosyncrasies did not align with the behaviour of a normal child. In the beginning, rather than embrace their child's individuality, they seemed almost mortified by it, which was an awful pity. I remember Skye's mother was terribly upset to find Skye eating insects in the backyard with such gusto, as if she was popping candy. "This one tastes like milk chocolate, Mum. This one tastes like chicken. Would you like one, Mummy? They're really yummy," she said, offering her mother this big, massive, wiggling white grub that made her mother recoil in disgust. "Skye," her mother had said in horror, "you mustn't eat insects. They're very bad for you. You shouldn't be putting stuff like that in your mouth." "But why not? The birds do it, and they taste really nice." In her turmoil, thinking that something was terribly unhinged about her daughter, Skye's mother sent her immediately to a psychologist who assured her that her child was indeed perfectly normal, but was just adventurous and inquisitive. "I assure you, Mrs. Cooper, there's nothing wrong with your daughter. She has above-average intelligence," she had assured her mother. "But you don't understand, Mrs. Barker, what I'm trying to tell you," Skye's mother had protested. "Skye is not at all like her other brothers and sisters. She'd rather play out of doors all the time than watch a movie or eat bugs rather than popcorn. Now that's not normal, surely." All things considered, the psychologist had reassured her that not all children are cookie-cutter copies of each other. "Try and embrace your daughter's quirky characteristics, Mrs. Cooper. You never know, she might grow out of some of her behaviours that you find so offensive. But I do want to assure you that your daughter is unusually bright. She's clever, astute, and perfectly normal." In my professional expert opinion, your daughter is much brighter than other children her own age. She appears to have a very sophisticated emotional intelligence for one so young, that I find really rather intriguing. Oh, I'm so relieved to hear you say that, Sky's mother had said. You have no idea, Mrs. Barker, how much more reassured I feel, having heard you say all this. I was so desperately worried about my daughter, as you can imagine, all her quirky behaviours. They were so unsettling for me, she said, reaching for a purse for a tissue to dab away the tears and to blow her nose very loudly. Me and my husband, let's just say, we've been terribly concerned about our daughter, being so different to our other children, of course. I assure you, Mrs. Cooper, being different is not a bad thing at all, the psychologist had said, smiling warmly at her mother. I'm sure some of the greatest people in our illustrious history have been very different, have had mothers like you worrying terribly about their child's quirky behaviours and idiosyncrasies. I'm sure Tesla, for example, must have been a very wacky, curious child. Probably gave his mother a few headaches and grey hairs, I imagine. Indeed, I'd loved Sky's individuality. She lived life so spontaneously, like a sparkling, bountiful river flowing a smooth course, without allowing anything to barricade its path. Sky never nursed any hang-ups or grievances like the rest of us invariably always do, when somebody mean says something to us that may torment us for days, possibly even years. By a gleaming contrast, nothing ever seemed to get Sky down. She was ebullient and resilient like a beach ball. If there was a fight among her brothers or sisters, Sky was the peacemaker, who seemed to be the conciliator or arbitrator, if you like. She calmed down the turbulent storm, putting an end to that fight so seamlessly. She hated discord or distension of any kind, but how she did this I never understood. She seemed to be instinctively highly intuitive. If her parents got angry with Sky, she wouldn't bat an eyelid. She was resilient to their irate, angry words that were like water off a duck's back to her. I would say to her, Sky, aren't you really upset? Your mother's just shouted at you, calling you a messy slob for bringing in a trail of dirt into the house. Sky would say to me, my mother's upset. She didn't mean to be hard on me. Look at it from her perspective. She loves that cream carpet of hers. And I've just selfishly trailed into the house a plethora of mud. I can understand why she's mad at me. One time her parents were having a huge blazing row. Her father had forgotten their wedding anniversary. Her furious, disgruntled, rather wounded mother was feeling hard done by and unfairly wronged. I'm sorry, her father had told his wife. I will not forget our anniversary next year. I promise you that. That's not good enough, Peter. I'm very upset with you, very disappointed. How could you forget our most special date like this? Sky's mother had said churlishly. She was visibly upset and affronted, storming off indignantly, with a dramatic theatrical display of her displeasure. She slammed the front door behind her with a mighty crash, hurriedly dashing towards her truck, climbing into it and slamming that door behind her, and revving up the engine so loudly to express the level of her extreme indignance. Then she drove away, in the process almost reversing her truck into the yard shed. Look at your mother, going off in such a huff like that. It's a wonder she didn't drive over the shed. Her father had sighed, watching her mother wearily from the kitchen window. So I forgot our wedding anniversary, he told Sky. Big deal. She's acting as if it's the end of the world. Sky had said to her dad, It is the end of the world for her, Dad. She thinks you don't love her any more. You should take her to a fancy restaurant tonight. It's not too late. Buy her something really lovely in the morning, some flowers and chocolates to make it up to her. Then Mum will be happy. It would seem her father had taken Sky's sagacious advice, for when her mother returned from her heated drive, her beleaguered mood was transformed and lifted by her father's profusive apologies. They had a joyous anniversary celebration at a very upmarket restaurant that night, so ostensibly, despite everything, Sky's father had redeemed himself. That was the special, rather unique thing about Sky. She had absolutely no ego. You could get as mad as hell at her. She never reacted aggressively. She could see things from another person's viewpoint, a rare, unusual quality that made her appear in my book superior in her emotional intelligence to the rest of us. One thing I was to learn about Sky growing up was that people would listen to her judicious advice, for her words of wisdom seemed to procure the right solution to a plethora of problems. I remember our class teacher asking Skye once why she thought her boyfriend was being so uffish with her. "I don't know what to do about it," she confided in Skye. "I don't want to lose him," she exclaimed. "I'm so desperately in love with the man. I want to marry him, but recently he's distancing himself from me. It's like he doesn't find me attractive anymore. I don't know what on earth I've done to offend him so much." Skye looked at her earnestly. "Your boyfriend does find you attractive, Miss Lawrence. Don't worry about that. But he doesn't like it that you've started smoking again. He finds the habit very objectionable. He hates the way you smell after you've been smoking. He'll never marry a smoker, so you better give up." I remembered the baffled teacher looked at Skye with a nonplussed expression on her face. "How do you know all this? How do you know that I recently started smoking?" Skye looked at the woman as if she was balmy. "But everyone must know you've started smoking. You stink of cigarettes." "But," said the teacher, "how do you know my boyfriend feels this way about smoking?" Again, Skye looked at the teacher as if her question was rather preposterous. "But isn't it obvious that this is what's going on?" Needless to say, the teacher's boyfriend did confess that since she'd started smoking, he was seriously considering calling it quits on their relationship, as the smell of the cigarettes offended him so much. Needless to say, the teacher gave up smoking immediately. The couple married a year later, possibly all thanks to Skye. I was drawn to Skye from a very young age. I remember deciding to myself that she was going to be my very best friend, and that was that. I liked her energy, her curiosity, the way she would stand over a butterfly, studying it for ages, marvelling at it with a reverent awe and inexhaustible fascination. She enabled me to pay greater attention to my environment and the things of the natural world, instead of observe it so fleetingly, as many of us are so often inclined to do. Skye loved to run around in her bare feet, which infuriated her parents, as they would say, "For goodness sake, Skye, put on your shoes and socks. Your feet are getting filthy. If you run around the place without your shoes, you'll develop very hard soles, which is very unbecoming for a young lady." She had said, "But, Mum, I like my feet touching the earth. The energy of the ground is very important for us. If I wear my shoes, there's a barrier to that energy, and that's not good, as that blocks you from the heartbeat of the earth. We need to align with that heartbeat." Skye's mother, who was well used to her daughter's individuality, raised her eyebrows in exasperation and said, "Whatever?" knowing only too well that ordering Skye to wear shoes would surely fall on deaf ears. When I was about 10 or 12, Skye would ride her bicycle to my house in the dead of night. She'd tap on the glass pane of my bedroom window to wake me up. I'd wiggle out of my window. We would tie our hammocks onto trees on the edge of the woodgrove. We would sleep under the open canopy of the stars, so that we could gaze up at the firmament, marvelling at the Milky Way, pointing out the different clusters of stars, their constellations, and what they symbolised. It would seem that Skye was well acquainted with them all. "Those are the Pleiades," she would say, "over there. They're known as the Seven Sisters. That's Sirius, the dog star. That's Polaris over there. That's a North Star. That one over there is Begas. It's known as Beta Orionis. Believe it or not, it's 900 light years away. That star is the blue star Vega. And that one's Antares, which is Alpha Scorpio. That star over there is the brightest star in the southern constellation, and it's known as Canopus." I was amazed by all her marvellous knowledge. It was exciting creeping out of my West Virginia red-brick farmhouse where I lived, at the dead of night, with my parents and 2 female siblings blindly oblivious to my mischievous actions. My mother would probably have had a coronary if she knew what I was getting up to, under the wayward influences of my best friend, who enabled me to see that you were really missing out an awful lot if you slept indoors all the time. "I don't understand why people like sleeping indoors," she would say to me. "Well, not when the weather is so good like this. You miss out so much. You miss out on the fresh air, the cool breeze, the sounds of the crickets and frogs, the glorious constellations, and of course the sunrise, along with the tweeting sounds of the dawn chorus in the mornings." Unbeknownst to my mother, I slept out of doors an awful lot with my best friend Skye quite frequently in the summer months, but we both lathered ourselves up well with mosquito repellent so that we could sleep easily, without being bitten to pieces by carnivorous mosquitoes. It was one of these nights that I first met Inoli. I remember as we were sleeping on our hammocks, a small silhouette was standing over us, watching us curiously through his deep-set dark eyes that twinkled with a red eye-shine. The creature was about 4 foot tall, thin and lanky, covered with long dark hair. He possessed a very human face. I remember opening my eyes and thinking, no, this has got to be a dream. But I pinched myself really hard, realizing that I was very much wide awake. This was no dream. This was no trick of the light or hallucination. "Don't be shy," I heard Sky's voice. "Please don't be shy. My name is Sky. That's my friend over there. Her name's Lorraine. What's your name?" The creature looked directly at Sky. I realized that they were engaging in a telepathic conversation, as Sky kept nodding and smiling at the creature. "I love that," she said. "Your name's Inoli, which means Black Fox. Why are you called Black Fox?" she laughed. "Because you were born so black from your mother's womb. Your grandmother thought the name was most befitting. That's incredible. I love your name." Over the summer months when I went and slept outdoors, me and Sky would play hide and seek with Inoli. We soon became firm friends. But I noticed even at such a young age that there was an undeniable chemistry between Sky and Inoli. She would look at me with twinkling eyes and say, "I've never met anyone like Inoli before. Do you know he makes my heart flutter? He's so intelligent. He's so beautiful." I must admit I also liked Inoli very much, but there was no way he made my heart flutter or my knees buckle like they did for her. I saw Inoli on and off over the course of those early years, as his family moved around West Virginia and further afield, rather like travelling gypsies. So there were long intercessions of time when we never saw the creature, but he was growing up remarkably quickly, getting taller and taller, bigger and bigger, and as he grew into his powerful new body, I couldn't help observing that Sky seemed rather besotted and infatuated by the creature. Of course, in those days I had no idea he was a Bigfoot. Sky insisted we never spoke about Inoli to our families, persuading me that they would never understand our relationship with the creature. In those days I always thought of Inoli as a human covered in a plethora of hair, otherwise not much difference to the rest of us. At that young age I was very accepting of his eccentric idiosyncrasies. I never got to meet his parents, but I do remember that Sky told me that Inoli had taken her to meet his entire family. I was so peeved off that I had not been invited to come along as well. That really got me very aggrieved for a long time, I'm not afraid to admit. I felt Sky had been favoured over me. Indeed, I had sneakily suspected from their first acquaintance that Inoli had his heart set on Sky from a romantic perspective. It seems my early inklings about the passion smouldering between the two of them was clearly not wrong. I mean, those two looked at each other with such a poignant, tangible love that even at 10 I would sometimes feel as if I was invading their space. The term you might use these days is get a room, although in those days the two of them had not consummated their relationship. "Why didn't you invite me to come along with you?" I'd complain bitterly. "That's not fair, Sky. You know that Inoli is my friend as well. I would have loved to have met his parents and his family." "He didn't want you to come along," Sky had said. "He wanted his family to meet me exclusively. It really wasn't personal. Inoli wanted his mother to become more acquainted with me." "What were they like?" I'd asked her. "Were they nice like Inoli? Did they look at all like him?" "They were so huge," said Sky, giggling. "Oh, my God, Lorraine, they were like giants. But yes, they did look like him. They had the typical pyramid head, overlong arms, the black, long flowing hair." "How big were they?" I asked. Sky thought about this for a moment. "Well, Inoli's dad is about 9 foot tall. His mother was about 7 foot, so she's quite a bit shorter than he was." "9 foot tall? Are you winding me up?" "No, I'm not." "I know," said Sky, giggling. "They were incredibly big. But his mother told me not to be intimidated by her size, that she wouldn't bite. She told me that Inoli had told her all about me. Can you believe that? He speaks about me to them." "Did Inoli tell her all about me too?" I asked. Sky flushed red with embarrassment. "I'm sure he must have mentioned you in passing." "I see, it's like that, was it? They were only interested in meeting you." "I should have guessed," I said indignantly. "That's lovely. I thought I was Inoli's friend as well." "Of course you're his friend. I know he likes you very much." "But not like he likes you," I protested. "Don't think I haven't noticed the way you look at each other. I know he's smitten about you." Do you think so? Said Sky, her eyes lighting up. I really like him too. I remember feeling like I wanted to hurl and be violently sick, for the green-eyed monster had reared its ugly head. I felt strangely envious of the relationship between Sky and Inoli, for it was such a wholesome, genuine love, a love I hoped that one day I might be able to find for myself. So tell me all about the family, I'd asked. They were terribly nice, she told me. Inoli's sister's older than he is. I thought she was really charming. At first she was rather shy. She was hiding behind a tree trunk, peering at me. Inoli had to drag her towards me. When I finally got to know her a bit better, she relinquished her earlier timorous reticence. Then she wouldn't stop garrulously chatting away in the anomalous language they speak. But Inoli helped me to comprehend exactly what she was saying. He speaks into my mind so eloquently. Well, what was she saying? She was telling me that since Inoli has met me, he's become incredibly happy. Wow, that's amazing, I said. Suffice to say, I'm not sure when me and Sky stopped seeing Inoli, but I do remember one day when Sky's eyes were red and inflamed. I realised Sky had been crying, which was incredulous for me, as nothing ever got her down. Only once in my life I had been eyewitness and privy to Sky crying, and that was the sad day her dog died. She was very distressed about that, but Inoli comforted her, assuring her that in death she would be reunited with her dog again. Are you sure? She'd asked Inoli. Very sure, he'd said. We always reunite with our loved ones in death. Why are you so upset? I asked Sky. You're crying. I can see you're crying. Inoli's going away with his family, she said. So I'm sure he'll be back soon. You know they travel all the time. He always comes back. Don't get yourself beat up about it. He'll be back sooner than you know. He says he's going away for a long time this time. His mother wants to test our love, to see how enduring it is. But what does that mean? She says he can come back to get me if he still feels the same way about me, when he's a lot older. Well, there you are, I'd said. I'm sure he'll be back. But in truth I doubted he would, but I never said as much to Sky. Surely when he was older he'd settle down and raise younglings with his own kind. But I never expressed my doubtful, sceptical thoughts to Sky, for I knew that if I did she would be devastated. But I was later to learn that sometimes the flames of love are not easily extinguished. In truth, I'm not going to lie. There was a rather small, jealous part of me secretly glad that Inoli was gone, for now I would have Sky's undivided attention all to myself, and as far as I was concerned, that was a very good thing. But I knew I would also miss Inoli, as he had been such a good, solid friend. Then came our teen years, and boy, that was an exciting time for a young teenager growing up in the 80s. And all these years later, on reflection, I do not think there was a better time to be alive and to be young. It was a time of big hair, and of course in London, England, it was the punk era in places like Carnaby Street and Piccadilly Circus. I do remember standing in front of the mirror with my hairbrush, fluffing my hair out as big as I could get it, and lacquering it down with a plethora of hairspray. It was the time of scrunchies, day-glow skirts, shoulder pads, leg warmers, and fabulous 80s music, from the likes of David Bowie, George Michael, Madonna, The Police, Boy George, Elton John, Michael Jackson, and so many more vibrant artists from that genre. It was a time of blockbuster movies, heartthrobs like Brad Pitt, Simon Le Bon, Robert Downey Jr., Bruce Willis, and Matt and Luke Goss. Many of my friends would grace their walls with posters of the men who made their hearts melt. But one person I knew did not get caught up in the ebullience of those wild frenzies was, of course, Sky. I do remember her bedroom walls were graced with images of trees and horses frolicking in the fields, which was very unusual for a teenage girl in those days. While we were all talking about boys, Sky would remain strangely indifferent and detached, listening to our conversations with a sad, wistful look in her eyes, as if her mind was 1,000 miles away. "What about you, Sky?" one of my friends had said to her. "Isn't there someone you've got the hots for? You never ever talk about boys. You're always so annoyingly secretive. How about Brad Pitt? Come on, he's a hottie. You've got to admit it." "He doesn't tickle my boat," said Sky, "though I do admit he's got quite nice eyes, but I prefer dark-haired men myself." "He doesn't tickle your boat?" said my friend Claudia. "You've got to be kidding. He's gorgeous." "I agree with Sky," said my friend Patricia. "Brad Pitt's blonde. Blonde hair does absolutely nothing for me. Sorry, Claudia, but I prefer my men with dark hair. Like Sky, tall, dark and handsome all the way. That's what I say. I agree, said Sky. You can't get better than that. Tall, dark and very handsome. So who do you fancy at the moment, Sky? Isn't there someone? Everyone had been spilling their guts about the boys in senior high whom tickled their fancy. But once again, Sky remained aloof and oddly quiet. Sky's face had blushed bright pink. She let out a little giggle. It was clear that Sky was brooding over a man, but who? I couldn't imagine. I'm afraid to say I had long since forgotten about Enoli. On the contrary, at school dances and social events, she seemed very disinterested in the men that were more than eager to ask her for a dance. But Sky never reciprocated the same level of enthusiasm. On the contrary, she seemed bored by the boys she met. I wasn't surprised that men gravitated towards her. It was funny she did not bother to dress up or spend hours on her makeup for any social occasions like the rest of us invariably did. On the contrary, Sky was so naturally beautiful that she'd walk into a room and all the men's eyes would be drawn to her. There was an energy about her, an aura if you like, beyond her physical appearance that made men and women alike want to bask in her presence, rather like lizards hungrily soaking up the sun on a rock. Sky had dark, long, shoulder-length hair, which in certain lights had a red undertone, blue-green eyes with a symmetrical oval face, but she had a wisdom about her, a kindness that was almost electric in its magnetic allure. One day I got a shock when my mother ushered me into the living room. Her face looked troubled. She gestured Sky's mother to take a seat. "Sweetheart, Mrs. Cooper would like to have some words with you concerning your friend Sky." I could see that Sky's mother looked distraught. Her eyes were so red as if she'd been crying for a very long time. "Are you all right, Mrs. Cooper?" I'd asked. "Is Sky all right?" "Of course she's not all right," my mother had snapped at me indignantly. "Can't you see she's upset? Mrs. Cooper is here about Sky, your very best friend, who has suddenly decided to elope with her boyfriend, a boyfriend we know nothing about. She says she's not coming back, that she's of age, so the police refuse to do anything about it. It's a dreadful, dreadful shame. What on earth is the world coming to, when the police won't even intercede on our behalf?" "I was wondering," said Mrs. Cooper, "if you might know, Lorraine, who she was seeing. Do you know who her boyfriend is? She never mentioned she was going out with anyone. That way we might be able to track her down. I'm so worried about my daughter. I need to know she's all right. She's far too young to be getting hooked up with a man. Worse still, we know nothing about him at all. He could be the axe murderer for all we know." I shrugged my shoulder. "You know Sky. She can be very secretive and elusive. As far as I know, she's not seeing anyone that I know about personally. Surely she wrote you a note to explain herself. Sky would never leave you in the lurch. It's not in her character." Mrs. Cooper pulled out a letter from her purse, handing it over for me to read. It read the following: "Dear Mum, Dad and family, I love you all very much. Don't ever forget that, not even for a fleeting second, because that is indisputable. This is the hardest letter I have to write. It doesn't come easily for me. I'm going away, and I won't be back, for I couldn't risk you trying to persuade me against the choices I am making for my life. For I do fear if you knew what they were, you would almost certainly ask me to abandon or revoke them, for you would not consider them pleasing in your sight. But what may bring you a measure of disapproval is where my heart lies. I have been in love with a man for longer than you may ever know, a man that I am sure would not meet with your acquiescent approval. But to me he is the quintessential love of my life. I could not live without him. For as long as I can remember I have dreamed of this day, when I would leave with him. My choice is not random. It is expeditiously proclaimed in my heart. It is where my destiny surely lies. It is the road I have decided to travel for my life. Do not hold this against me, nor place resentment in your heart, for I am doing what is best for me. Know always that I love you. Please do not pine for the choices I have made, for in them I have found my fullest expression of joy. Your beloved daughter Sky. P.S. I will write to you from time to time to let you know how I am doing." It was then that it hit me like a brick in the head, as all the memories of our early childhood with Enoli came flooding back. Oh my God, I thought, he came back to get her. They've gone off together. Suddenly it made perfect sense to me. All her disinterest in other boys, the wistful nostalgic longing on her face. I always remembered the magnetic attraction between Skye and Inoli. It had been electric. I had underestimated the power of their love. I knew she would be safe with Inoli, but I perceived her parents would never ever endorse the relationship, for Inoli was not exactly son-in-law material, as living in caves, sleeping out under the canopy of stars, eating insects, fish, wild berries and wild animals, was not the kind of life that they would envisage for their daughter, but it was what Skye hankered after. I'd never known her to have a materialistic bone in her body. I imagined being married to an affluent up-and-coming doctor and living in a fabulously ostentatious apartment in Charleston, Lexington or Morganstown was much more what Skye's parents had forecast for her future. "Oh, my God," said Mrs. Cooper. "You know something, don't you? I can see it in your eyes, Lorraine. Now, don't you dare lie to me. I need to know exactly where my daughter is." "Well, I do know the man she was seeing, but I don't know anything about where he lives. I do know this, though, that he will take very good care of your daughter. He does love her very much." "Well, what does he do for a profession?" asked Mrs. Cooper. "What is his name?" "I think he's a geologist," I said, discerning that Inoli was close to the earth, so that was the best way I could describe him, that might give poor Mrs. Cooper a measure of reassurance. "His name is Inoli, but I don't know his surname." "Inoli?" said Mrs. Cooper, looking mortified. "He's not foreign, is he? That sounds like a foreign name." "No, he's not foreign." "Are you sure about that? It's a very unusual name." "Goodness gracious, I mean, who calls their son Inoli? I ask you, it's rather an appalling name. These days parents go out on a limb to call their kids these preposterous names. They think they're being so trendy. Why, I heard only recently a mother called her baby Strawberry. I mean, I ask you, what on earth is going on with people these days? I dread to think, what's wrong with names like James, John, Mark, Luke, Matthew? More to the point, before I veer off the subject, what does this Inoli look like?" she asked. "He's not covered in tattoos, is he, with hundreds of those god-awful ear piercings?" "No, I can assure you he doesn't look like that." "Well, that's an awful relief. That's one thing at least," said Mrs. Cooper, dabbing her forehead with her tissue. "I think I would describe him as tall, dark and handsome." "Honestly," said Mrs. Cooper, "Skye really is the end. I don't have a problem with her dating a handsome geologist. On the contrary, the reverse is true. Honestly, what is going on with that daughter of mine?" "Well, you know, Skye," I said, "she was never like the other peas in a pod. Besides," I said, trying to be reassuring, "if she writes to you from time to time, well, then you're going to know she's fine, aren't you? It would be like living in America, and your daughter living in New Zealand, sending you a letter. It would be just like that. No different, really." "I hadn't thought of it like that," said Mrs. Cooper, blowing her nose. "I suppose you have a point there. I mean, a lot of mothers are separated by their kids, by a vast ocean between them, and they manage to keep holding it together, don't they?" "Absolutely," said my mother. "You always knew that Skye was different to your other kids anyway. You said as much, didn't you? By all accounts, she's doing fabulously well for herself, having landed a tall, dark, handsome geologist for a husband. In my book, there's nothing to be sad about that. In fact, it's something to celebrate." "Even so," said Mrs. Cooper, "I wish my daughter wasn't so damned reclusive. Full of secrets, that girl. She was always so secretive. You never knew what she was thinking. It was so exasperating. I mean, I would really have loved to have met my son-in-law. I'm sure we would have got on like a house on fire. Still, maybe one day when she comes to her senses she'll introduce us to him." My mother's words must have stuck, as when anyone inquired as to the whereabouts of Skye, word spread around that she had snagged for herself a tall, dark, handsome geologist, and they were now living far away in New Zealand. I think Mrs. Cooper could not bear for people to think that her daughter had left home for good and was never coming back. On the face of it, I really was quite miffed, somewhat nettled with Skye. She was my best friend after all, and Inoli had been our childhood secret, that had never been exploited or shared with anyone else. I felt aggrieved that she had not told me that they had rekindled their love, that she was going away with him for good. To be fair, I knew she would suit living out in nature far better than living in our material-driven society, consumed by money, power, status and success, for that was a world that would have pilfered Sky's joy faster than a vacuum cleaner, sucked the very life out of her. I knew she had taken blankets, clothing and sleeping bags, hairbrushes, pots and mugs with her, some human stuff that she would prefer not to live without, as her mother claimed a whole lot of stuff like that appeared to be missing after Sky had left, which she found rather peculiar. Of course I did not. I also felt even more upset that Sky had not even said goodbye to me. I think that ruffled me the most, as Sky had always told me that I was closer than a sister to her. Apart from anything else, I would miss my childhood friend, on whom the foundations of our solid friendship had been cemented. 2 years went by. I awoke one night to hear a knocking at my window. I was shocked and overjoyed to see it was Sky. I could hardly believe it. It was like the old days again. I glanced at her through the window. Her face was animated. She looked incredible. I was no longer the skinny 10-year-old kid that could squeeze through the window, so I had to go around through the back kitchen door to see Sky. We both just literally embraced, crying into each other's arms. "It's so good to see you," she said, hugging me. "I've missed you so very much, Lorraine, more than you'll ever know. But I have to tell you I am very happy. I don't regret going away." "Well, you do look great. You look happy. You're positively glowing, I have to say." "I admit I've never been happier, although I do miss a few things, like hot showers, hot cups of coffee, and pizza slices. There is you and my family, of course, that I miss more than ever. Other than that, I pretty much have hit the jackpot in my life. Meeting Inoli was the best thing that has ever happened to me. You do understand that, don't you, Lorraine?" "Of course I understand all that, and I'm so thrilled you're so happy. I really am. But I'm not going to lie, I did feel affronted and hacked off that you never said goodbye to me when you left. You never even left me a note. You just bogged off into the sunset without a bye or leave. How do you think that made me feel? I mean, I'm supposed to be your very best friend, but you didn't even extend me the same courtesy you showed your own mother. I was browned off, I have to tell you." "I know. I'm awfully sorry," said Sky, throwing her arms around me again, while I wept into her shoulders, my tears soaking her shirt. "I'm sorry, Lorraine," she said, wiping my tears away with her thumbs. "In truth, I didn't have time, as Inoli came back to get me. You see, his mum realised that his heart was set on me. He couldn't be swathed to pair up with one of his own kind, which she hoped would ultimately happen, and it didn't. Finally, she agreed for me to become part of their lives. I just adore living close to nature, Lorraine, and I adore Inoli. Our life really works for us." "I'm happy," I said. "I really am. I know I'm being selfish and self-centred, but I do miss you, that's all." "I have a daughter," said Sky, her eyes lighting up like a firework on the 4th of July, her smile so broad it almost took over her entire face. "You have a daughter? You're kidding. Does she look like you?" "Well, not exactly. Let's just say she looks more like Inoli, which is a good thing, really. She doesn't need to wear clothes like me. She's inherited her father's long, flowing, thick, dark hair. But Inoli believes she's got my face, and she can speak English. I taught her from the moment she was born. Spoke it all the time, we did." "Wow," I said. "That's amazing. You will meet her in a moment, I promise you that. I told Inoli I needed to pop around to see you first, as you're my contact with my old life, by which I can be able to keep abreast of all the goings-on in your world. So far apart from mine, of course. Why don't you come and have a hot shower, I said. I'll make you that cup of coffee you've been wistfully dreaming about." "Now you're talking," said Sky. I remember she spent ages in the shower washing her dark hair. Then she came out of the shower smelling like lavender, with her hair all washed, which she persuaded me to trim with a pair of scissors, which I told her to keep, because her hair was literally so long I could hardly believe it. It was way past her shoulders. We sat down and had coffee together. I updated her with comings and goings of her family and friends. She was fascinated to hear their news and to be kept abreast of everything. I gathered a whole lot of casual stuff in my wardrobe, like anoraks and leggings that I didn't need anymore, with some bottles of instant coffee and powdered milk that she was happy to take, and in turn she gave me a letter for her parents. It was later that evening that I saw Inoli again. I was shocked when I saw him, not only because he spoke to me in fluent English which he had learnt from Sky, and said to me, "Hello, Lorraine, how are you? Long time no see." He gave me a big affectionate hug, which I returned, but because he was utterly enormous. I mean, he was titanically big. I'd remembered him over the years of our childhood, getting significantly bigger, but let's just say now he was Herculean in his proportions, and next to Skye he totally dwarfed her. He looked like a towering tree, Skye a mere sapling. I would say he was about 8 foot tall, 700 pounds. His hair was blacker than coal. I couldn't believe his size, and the muscle density and girth of him was mighty impressive. Let's just say he could give a high-profile bodybuilder a run for his money without any problems at all. Skye tells me that you were very upset all those years back, when I didn't take you to meet my parents. I want to express how very sorry I am about that.
Oh, that, I said, shrugging. That's nothing, it's water under the bridge now. I've got over it, I've grown up.
No, I need to explain myself, said Inoli. You see, when I was bringing Skye to meet my mother, I had a secret agenda of my own. I was bringing her back to show my mother the woman I wanted to marry, to spend the rest of my life with, so to speak.
You get married in your culture, I gasped.
No, not in a traditional way, not like you. But we do have a ceremony of sorts that I would acquaint with marriage. Of course, if I meet someone I like, I'm expected to always get my parents' approval.
And your mother did approve of Skye?
Oh, she did, but she had very big reservations in the beginning about Skye's hairless body, her low level of strength and power that our kind has. My mother was overly concerned that Skye would be too feeble, not be able to cope with our lifestyle long term, that she would hanker after the things of your material world, like your cars, houses, clothes, stuff like that. But it seems she was wrong, her misgivings unfounded.
And now what does your mother think of Skye?
I think sometimes she forgets how tiny Skye is, how she doesn't have any hair, because she sees Skye as one of us now.
Where is your child? I hear you have a daughter. Skye said you brought her along. Skye grinned, pointing at the tree. She's hiding behind the tree over there. She's desperately shy, I'm afraid. Oh, Juanita, called Skye. Come on, sweetheart. Don't be shy. I've got a friend here who'd love to meet you. I could perceive a dark, hairy face peeking at me from behind the tree, seemingly uneager to step forward. Juanita, Skye continued. Don't be shy. Lorraine won't bite. She's very nice. You will like her, I promise you. What does Juanita mean? I asked. It means fawn, said Skye. Why did you call her that? I asked curiously.
In our culture, Inoli exclaimed. It's usually the grandmother that names the child, so it was my mother's honour and privilege to do so. When Juanita came out of Skye's womb, she looked just like a fawn.
At that moment the little kid scuttled towards us, trying to hide behind her father as she looked at me. She looked exactly like her father, only she was only 3 foot tall at this stage, with overlong arms, a pyramid-shaped head, long flowing black hair all over her body, but with a face that almost looked like a carbon copy of Skye's, only instead of her eyes being dark like her dad's, they seemed to be green. Juanita is the apple of her grandmother's eye, laughed Skye. In her book, Juanita can do no wrong. I'm glad to tell you that over the years Skye's parents have received letters from their daughter, whom they still claim is married to a geologist living in New Zealand, and when asked by curious people why they haven't visited Skye yet, the parents both claim they can't cope with the long-distance travel. As for me, I continue to see Skye from time to time, but it is always random and fleeting, and usually when I'm not expecting a visit. She has had a boy that looks identical to Dad. I keep a supply of stuff such as coffee and clothes for my friend when she arrives on the scene unannounced. I also leave stuff for other Bigfoots to pass over to her, in a bag in my barn. I will say this, though. She remains head over heels in love with Inoli, and he with her. So there is a great, very successful love story by all accounts. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it had been a while since my daughter Natalie had left home to live with her boyfriend Rusty. As a single mother, it was hard to see her pack up her bags to leave home, as irrefutably I was left with an empty nest, fully aware that I was all on my own. Granted, I had many lovely friends of similar ages to myself, all caught up in a similar conundrum, having to face the stark certitude that their kids had left home for good.
I remember watching the birds nesting in my backyard, marvelling at their tenacious resilience in raising their young, and letting them fly far away without fretting about it at all. Why could I not be like that, I'd wondered. It had not come easily to me, I'm afraid, as when Natalie announced she was leaving home for good, I felt as if someone had put a dagger in my guts. My friends had all audaciously assured me that they had felt much the same way when their kids had left home. "Don't worry, Hilda. It'll get a lot better, I promise you." "But you still have your husbands," I'd exclaimed defensively. "I have no one apart from our dog Benji and our cat Antonio, and they're both long in the tooth now." "Have you forgotten something, Hilda? We live in a university town, for goodness sake, so if you want to bring some youthful vitality into your home, just advertise for lodgers. Your accommodation will be snapped up in no time at all. Of course, then you know what will happen. Your house will be inundated with young university students. Then you'll be begging for some personal space, forgetting that you ever felt lonely in the first place," they teased. "I'm not exactly champing at the bit to have a lodger," I had said, "but I do admit it might help alleviate the dreadful loneliness I feel." "But why are you lonely, Hilda?" my friend Janice had said, giving my hand a tight squeeze. "You've got us, and all you have to do is to pick up the telephone and give us a call. We'll be around your place in a shot." I said nothing, nodded appropriately at the right words, taking a sip of my Sauvignon Blanc, and inwardly squirming. I don't think my friends perceived or comprehended my abject plight remotely. They all had husbands after all. How could they? I'd only ever had children. My oldest daughter, Tanya, was married with 2 children. She was now living in Florida. My husband and I had got divorced almost a lifetime ago. I had never ever remarried. I remember waking up in the morning, feeling as desolate, isolated and barren as the Sahara Desert. I was used to hearing Natalie pottering around in the kitchen, in the early hours of the morning, making coffee and pop-ups, while listening to the radio, or having a plethora of her university friends popping over for a cup of coffee during the day. So the house was a buzzing beehive, with ongoing activity in my home. I was fortunate to live in a lovely semi-detached home in Boston, in a fabulous, youthful, vibrant, green leafy area, in the university town, with a plentitude of exciting things to do. But now with Natalie out of the way, I did feel very companionless, sequestered and estranged, terribly, terribly alone. It was rather like a big part of me was now missing. It was inevitable that now my journey through life would be entirely solo. I reassured myself that in only a matter of time I would feel a whole lot better about this prospect. I would soon adjust to life on my own. I mean, how hard could it possibly be? I just needed to busy myself with creative outlets and activity. Maybe take up painting or pottery, get involved in a book club. A friend of mine had suggested I begin dating again, but I was a dinosaur in that department. I saw dating as, let's just say, a logistics nightmare. It was not a hoop that I fancied jumping through. Once bitten, twice shy, shall we say. There was one issue that was plaguing and irking my heart like a virus, that I could not shake off in any way. It was something burning inside me like an insatiable, inexhaustible fire that simply could not be extinguished, or an itch, if you like, that you simply can't stop scratching. The first time I had met Rusty, on the surface he looked like a very nice, hard-working university student. But there was something about him I didn't like, but I couldn't for the life of me fathom what it was. On the face of it, I was incessantly bothered by Natalie's boyfriend every time he was in my presence, like a mosquito buzzing around me that evaded my ability to swat it. I had noticed he was very reclusive, tight-mouthed, introverted and unforthcoming, so I pretty much knew nothing about him. When I asked Natalie about his early years growing up in Boston as a young boy, she could not enlighten me any further. "He doesn't want to talk about his life as a young boy," she told me. "He tends to clam up, get uptight and twitchy if I broach the subject with him." "Well, sweetheart, don't you think you have a right to know about his young life?" She had shaken her head. "Look, Mum, why should I pry? We all have secrets. If he doesn't want me to know about his childhood, who am I to interrogate him? It's none of my business, frankly." "I don't agree," I'd insisted. "It is your business. If you're so serious about Rusty, you deserve to know about his early life. You haven't even met his family yet. Don't you think that's awfully strange?" "That's because they don't get on." "Well, why don't they get on?" I asked my daughter. "Surely he's given you his reasons." My daughter had become exceedingly wound up. She'd raised her voice at me indignantly. "I can't pressurise him to talk about something he designates not to discuss with me, Mum." "Fair enough," I said, raising a cynical eyebrow. "But don't you think it's ever so slightly odd, sweetheart? I think this refraining from talking to you about his childhood is a red flag, if you ask me." "Don't be ridiculous, Mum. You don't know what you're talking about," my daughter chided defensively. "We can't all be like you, Mum, braving our souls to the entire world, wearing our hearts on our sleeves. Some of us are just a little bit more reserved, I'd like to say." "Fair enough," I'd said again. I mean, what else could I say? But I certainly could smell a rat. Something was distinctly off about that boy. All my girlfriends had met Rusty, thought he was perfectly lovely, except for my best friend Prudence, who, as her name implies, was one of the most prudent, judicious and sagacious people that I'd ever met. She was known as Wise Brown Old Owl. She was always bang on the money with her astute observations. One day she put down her teacup, looked at me through her very perceptive brown bear-like eyes. "I don't know how to say this to you, Hilda, but we've always been candid with each other, have we not?" "Of course," I said. "Now out with it, Prudence. You know I won't take offence to whatever you're going to tell me." I was waiting for her to tell me she loathed my new hairstyle, or the current colour of my lipstick that I'd recently taken to wearing, but I couldn't have been more wrong. "Well, it's your daughter's boyfriend, Rusty. I don't like him, dear. I don't like him at all. I'm sorry to have to say this and to be so brutally honest, but he makes my skin crawl. Something about him. I can't put a finger on it, but I really don't like him." I could have hugged Prudence when she was so forthright with me, for it relinquished my own guilt that I'd been feeling, as the dislike I held towards Rusty had been festering away like an inflamed boil that could not be calmed. Prudence looked surprised when I was heartily relieved by her comments. "I thought you were going to bite my head off, Hilda, for saying something negative about your daughter's boyfriend. As to be fair, on the surface he has everything going for him, does he not? A law degree, and by all accounts he comes from a wealthy, established background. I mean, that's not to be sniffed at, is it, dear? But there's something I can't quite put my finger on, something that irks me, ruffles my feathers, so to speak. Not to put too fine a point on it, of course. Please, Prudence, I'm not mad at you at all. As usual, you're my only friend that actually gets it. And you're categorically right. On the surface, Rusty looks like a potential mother-in-law's dream. But there's something that makes my instincts scream with trepidation about him. I can't think what it is." "So then, how serious is your daughter over Rusty?" asked Prudence, her face registering concern. "Very," I said, taking a large gulp of tea to reassure my heightened anxiety that seemed to spread its wings every time Rusty's name was ever mentioned. "They have been talking wedding bells, actually." "Oh, no," said Prudence, putting her cup down reflectively. "That is not good. That's exactly my thinking. So I was rather crafty, actually." "How so?" "Well, I lied to my daughter. I told her that if she was going to marry Rusty now, that all my finances are tied up at the moment. So if she's desirous for that quintessential perfect white wedding with all the trimmings, she'd have to wait a couple of years for that. I thought it might buy some time for the cracks to start showing in their relationship. So perhaps the rose-coloured spectacles might melt away, and my daughter might see him for who he is. Although what he is, I don't know, really." "Clever girl," said Prudence. "You're not just a pretty face, Hilda, dear. You're savvy and shrewd, let me tell you that." "But 2 years," I said, sighing. "Is that enough time for her to see what he's really about? Even you and I cannot figure out why we dislike him so much. Look, Hilda, instincts are not to be sneezed at. One should always listen to them, for they alert us to a truth we cannot see. It's our subconscious mind telling us to pay attention. In my book, time can be a remarkable way of getting to know someone a lot better. If the worst comes to the worst and she marries the man, at least you'll be there to pick up the pieces. But we can hope that it never comes to that. But if it does, so be it. As for your daughter, whatever challenge she goes through, when she comes out the other end, she'll be all the more wiser from the experience. Sometimes the hardest lessons in life can be the making of us. It's like chiselling away at a block of marble until you get to the masterpiece. The chiselling hurts like hell, but it's worth it in the end." I sat there in my quiet kitchen on a Saturday night, prudently reflecting over Prudence' poignant words, whilst drinking a glass of white wine. Every time I thought about Rusty, I'd take a huge gulp. An uneasiness overcame me. Drinking the alcohol that I could barely taste, which was an awful pity, as it was an expensive bottle of wine, seemed to anaesthetize my troubled mind. What was it about him I didn't like? I glanced down at my feet. Our old black Labrador dog Benji was curled up beside my leg, snoring loudly, while my marmalade cat Antonia was spread out on my lap, coiled up into a round furry ball. It was funny how in this big house we were all curled up together like this, offering each other solace and comfort in the soundless place. "Move," I said, putting Antonia on the floor, raising myself off the chair. "I'm going to bed. I'm really tired." I could hear Benji and Antonio trotting behind me. I knew very shortly they'd be joining me on my oversized king-size bed, and in truth I would be very glad for their company. I climbed into bed, my weary exhaustion overtaking me, the inebriating effects of the alcohol dulling my overactive mind, so that the nagging feelings about my daughter were significantly stilled and suppressed. Before long I'd fallen fast asleep, but I awoken to hear someone moving around in my kitchen. I could hear a clanging sound and the tinkling of cutlery. What on earth was going on? I sat up in alarm, realizing with horror that someone had broken into my house. But who? My heart began to race as I tiptoed cautiously down the sweeping staircase, holding the fire poker from my bedroom fireplace in my hands. On reflection, I should have possibly called 911. Still, now that I was on the ground floor, I might as well take a peek to see who was loitering about in my kitchen. I could see the kitchen light was on. The brazen audacity of it all, I thought. Whoever had broken into my house wasn't even afraid of switching on the lights. Then I saw her. It was my daughter Natalie. She almost jumped out of her skin when she saw me standing there with the fire poker extended in my hand, ready to beat her up, as I peered at her furtively through the kitchen door. I had so nearly lashed out at her when I had seen the dark, unfamiliar silhouette moving towards me. "Mum! Oh my God, you scared me, the living hell out of me! Oh, I'm freaked out! You were standing there with that poker! Oh my goodness, I saw your reflection on the wall! I thought I was about to have my head annihilated by the axe murderer. Oh, sorry, darling. I heard a noise in the kitchen. I got frightened. But what are you doing in the house in the middle of the night like this?" "I thought you were with Rusty. I thought you were invited out to have dinner with him and his parents." Natalie burst into tears. That was when I noticed the ghastly pronounced black bruises around her eye. Her eye was so badly swollen that it was hidden behind a mound of inflammation, was almost extinguished by the surplus of excess skin that buried it like a chocolate button in a rounded doughnut. "How did this happen, Natalie? Who did this to you?" Natalie could barely say the words. Then she whispered, "Rusty." "But why, darling? I don't for the life of me understand." I took my daughter into the kitchen. Over another bottle of Sauvignon Blanc, which I really did not need, as I'd already overindulged, but I couldn't let her drink alone, I poured 2 glasses. The wine seemed to medicate my daughter's frazzled nerves, so finally she began to speak. "Mum," she said, looking at me earnestly, "there's something wrong with Rusty. I mean really wrong. He's not right in the head, Mum. He really is a very violent man, underneath the quiet reserve." "I never knew this before, Mum. I never had any idea about it. But last night I saw it for the first time. You see, I met his family at the family barbecue. I noticed the tension between Rusty and his family, who by all accounts are rather decent, convivial people, actually. Nothing like Rusty declared them to be. I took Rusty's brother Duncan to one side and cross-examined him. According to Duncan, he's always been predisposed to violent outbreaks." "Really?" I said. "His brother told you that?" Natalie nodded solemnly. "I liked Duncan very much. His brother was terribly nice. He actually advised me to end things with Rusty." "Really?" I said, raising a questionable brow. "Well, I never. His own brother said that to you? Now that is one for the books. He said that I was a terribly nice girl. I deserved to know what I was getting myself into. He told me that Rusty was institutionalized when he was about 12 years old. He did terrible things, Mum. He beat up his own parents and his own siblings really badly. At one time his mother's head injury was so bad she was taken to accident and emergency. Another time he burnt the family house down. To a cinder, I gather. He even put a poisonous snake in his brother's bed once. He also put poison in a family casserole, which meant that the entire family, with the exception of himself, of course, had to be hospitalised and have their stomachs pumped. I gasped. That's appalling! Why would he do these dreadful things to his own family? I gather he has this insatiable anger. By all accounts, he was very quiet and subdued as a young boy, but whenever he got incensed about something, he became like a rabid dog. He would break things, become inflamed with anger, especially when he never got his own way. I gather he had no boundaries. He would physically attack his own mother. Sometimes it took more than 3 men to hold him down. It was like he was possessed by a demon. Well, how did they manage to calm him down then, I asked. He certainly doesn't strike me as violent these days. Well, he's heavily medicated now. He has to take these medications every day of his life to function well in normal society, so that it suppresses his violence. But his brother warned me, if he did stop taking those meds, there would be hell to pay, and that there was always the potential that something would set him off, even if he's on meds. It turns out he was right about that, she said, pointing to her eye. Why on earth would Rusty hit your eye like that? You see, what happened was Duncan, Rusty's brother, was telling me all these things. I think Rusty got jealous because he was viewing us from a distance. His imagination was in overdrive. He thought I was really hitting on his brother. I'd never seen him like that before. He just began to beat up his brother. He then punched me in the eye. He was saying he would kill me. How dare I flirt with his brother so outrageously? Did I have no shame? I've never seen him explode like that before. It was like he became completely unhinged. The whole thing turned terribly nasty. The police were invariably called. Rusty was taken away in handcuffs. When I saw him like that, Mum, it was like I was seeing him for the very first time. I remember thinking, I never want to see you again as long as I live. When moments before, Mum, I couldn't imagine my life without him. Now how does that happen? Anyway, Rusty's mother cleaned up my eye. She was terribly nice. She told me that the best thing I could ever do was to get away for a couple of months so that I'm completely out of Rusty's hair. And I should just write him a note ending things with him cordially. She said that was the best thing I could do. His mother said that to you? Yes, said Natalie. She knows that the medication can only suppress that much, you see. Yes, he can function in normal society very well, thank you very much. But if someone close to him upsets him, there's a very big danger of him becoming unbalanced and psychotic. You see, the medication is antipsychotic medication. Well then, that is what you're going to have to do. You must disappear for a couple of months. I'll cover all the costs for you. The main thing is for you to keep safe, so that Rusty will not find you. I'll plead ignorance if he should come by asking for you. Natalie's story. They never tell you, do they, that it can take a minute of time for your entire world to come crashing down, crumbling into hundreds of thousands of pieces, like a gingerbread house that has become brittle. What you thought was your life is now lying in your hands, rather like a broken piece of porcelain that no superglue in the world can put back together again. Rather like the nursery rhyme character Humpty Dumpty. Well, it had happened to me. The very man I thought I was going to marry had turned out to be a loaded landmine. It had all begun when Rusty had decided to take me home for a family barbecue. I think it's important you meet my family, but I need to warn you, we have never been close. There's a bit of bad blood between us, but the least said about that, the better. I had pressurized him to take me to meet his family. Reluctantly, he had agreed. It turned out to be a revelatory, life-changing experience, for the dynamics of his family was nothing like I'd expected or anticipated. I was soon to discover he came from a solid family background and was raised in a loving, nurturing environment. This I had not expected, for in the past, when I'd broached the subject about his ambiguous childhood, it was always quickly shut down. We had talked about getting married. He had made it unequivocally clear that his family would not be invited to our wedding under any circumstances. I could see a hatred wash over his face. I wondered if he had been abused when he was younger. I knew this bad blood he was talking about was very significant. I wanted to get to the bottom of it, so I wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. I'd love to meet your family, I'd told him. As you can imagine, I was amazed that his affluent family lived 4 miles away from downtown Boston in Norfolk County, in the town of Brooklyn, 6 square miles of land, which is one of the largest towns in New England. It is the birthplace of the 35th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, and is considered one of the best places to live in Massachusetts. So let's just say they were exceedingly well off, with very deep pockets. I have to say that when Rusty drove up the long meandering red brick driveway, framed by rolling, perfectly manicured viridescent green lawns, flower beds bursting with colourful perennials, a scattering of trees and perfectly manicured hedges of a colonial revival home, let's just say I was completely transfixed, as the ostentatious flamboyant house looked more like an imposing mansion than a house. It was a very large white 2-story mansion with huge windows, black shutters and a grey slate roof, along with a pedimented front doorway. "Your parents live here?" I gasped, suddenly feeling completely intimidated and so underdressed, realising that the jeans I was wearing didn't look appropriate for a home as sumptuous as this. "Don't feel intimidated. My parents are just regular people." Rusty had been absolutely right. His parents were indeed regular convivial people, not pretentious or conspicuously pompous in any way, which I'd rather suspected would be the case, before I saw their grand palatial mansion, that is. I couldn't fathom when we sat down to eat the sizzling delicious melt-in-the-mouth barbecue meat, with its aromatics caramelised-like smells, why his elegant, rather stylish, ill-at-ease mother kept giving me anxious, agitated glances. I had noticed that both Rusty's parents had given their son a wide berth when we had arrived on the scene. To be fair, his mother had managed to give him a half-hearted hug, saying, "It's nice to see you, dear." "And who is this that you have here?" she said, giving me a warm, welcoming smile. "This is my girlfriend, Mum. Natalie is her name. I thought it was time you met her." "I see," said her mother, eyeing me up and down with a worried look on her face. I could see her recoil and shudder almost as if she was afraid of her own son when he brushed past her in the entrance hall. It was like she actually flinched, as if she half expected him to punch her. Rusty's father appeared to be very guarded in his conversation, while he kept his wary eyes pinned on Rusty, as if he felt his own son could not be trusted. While we were sitting eating the most delicious meat at the table, the awkwardness had been so unsettling, as no one had said anything. The conversation had been as stiff as a starched collar. I knew something dramatic had happened in this family, as even Rusty's 2 brothers looked as if they would rather be anywhere else in the world than having lunch with their older brother. I was sure I could pick up a fearful energy. You don't imagine something like that. "It's very kind of you to have invited us over for this barbecue," I'd said, desperately trying to find some conversation. "I've been looking forward to meet you. Rusty's told me an awful lot about you." Of course, that was a big lie, but it sounded good, didn't it? "Has he?" said Rusty's mother, eyeing her son dubiously, while taking a large glug of her wine. For a moment it almost looked as if she was trembling. What the heck was going on? It was as if this entire family was intimidated by their own son. I needed answers, so I whispered to Duncan, Rusty's brother, that I needed a private word with him. He had whisked me away to a private spot under a large oak tree, in their yard, with eyes that, if I was not mistaken, looked to be full of trepidation. "What do you want to know?" he asked me with a defensive tone in his voice. "I want to know why your family is behaving in such a weird way, as if they're scared stiff of Rusty. What's going on?" "It's war wounds," he said. "Baggage we carry from our past experiences with him." It was then that Duncan opened up and told me about a grievous, harrowing childhood, wrought with consternation, apprehension and inquietude, as living with his brother Rusty was like living with an untamed beast, who could lash out at you potentially at any time, pouncing on you, tearing you apart. For he was as temperamental as the weather. One minute he could be terribly congenial, the next minute a menacious monster, out for your blood. He was out of control, Duncan told me. We knew our lives were in perilous danger. We would lock our bedroom doors every night. We knew that Rusty was capable of great evil. You see, when he got mad, he lost control. He didn't know how to stop his anger. But I don't understand. He seems so normal now. I've never seen a violent side to him at all. Normal? Is that what they call it now? Scoffed Duncan, raising a cynical brow.
How normal can taking hundreds of pills every day be to suppress your volatile tendencies?
Oh, he told me those were vitamins.
Duncan nearly choked on his drink. Is that what he said? No, they are not vitamins. They're serious antipsychotic drugs. They're the only reason that he's allowed to live a normal life. Without them, well, let's just say he can become exceedingly violent, very volatile. What's going on here? Said Rusty, coming up to us with a large glass of craft beer in his hands. This looks very cosy. A little too cosy by all accounts, brother dear. I told her, Rusty. I told Natalie. She deserves to know the truth. I told her those pills you are taking are not vitamins. I could see now that Rusty was seething. His jaw was tightening and clenching. His face grew red. Then he began to scream. How dare you tell her about that, Duncan? He then reached for his brother, grabbing him by the scruff of the neck, lashing at him violently with his fists. The next thing I knew was that Rusty began to get out of control, like a frenzied lunatic, while his father was trying to break up the fight. Calm down, Rusty. There's no need to overreact, son. Calm down. He said this as if it was a mantra that I imagined he must have repeated over and over again during his childhood. I was screaming, please stop, Rusty, you're hurting Duncan, stop hitting him. The tears were streaming down my face. The next thing I knew was that Rusty turned around and leered at me, with a hostile look in his eyes. Then his fist went straight into my eye. As for you, why were you outrageously flirting with my brother? I did not even scream as his fist went pounding into my eye. I stared at him as the blood ran down my face. I remember thinking, I don't know this man. Everything happened so fast, as it always does in cases of shock. The police were called. Rusty was taken into custody, and then his mother attended to my wound. I'm very sorry, dear. You see, my son cannot function in society like you or me. He visits his therapist 3 times a week in order to see how he's doing. He's taking medications to suppress and manage his anger. But when Duncan told you about his mental history, that pushed him over the edge. That's all it takes. Something that gets him to get really mad, and then he can just lose it all. My advice for you, my dear, is to get away for a couple of months, to let the dust settle. End things with my son for your own good. Please do. You don't want to be walking on eggshells for the rest of your life, wondering if anything you might say could potentially trigger an explosive situation. You seem like such a lovely girl. You don't want to marry my son. He is expected to tell any potential bride of his about his condition. But I know my son, and I know he won't. He'd be too frightened to lose you. That's the problem. So now here I was, having taken Rusty's mother's wizened advice. I took an almost 4-hour flight to Charleston, West Virginia, and now a taxi was taking me on a long journey to a remote little cabin tucked away in the heart of the West Virginia countryside. I had done some grocery shopping in Charleston. I was biting my lips, wondering how I'd keep myself busy in a remote cabin for 2 months. Still, it had to be done. Besides, I told myself it's going to be fun, a perfect opportunity to spend some time with myself, which would be an experience of a lifetime, as having been around people all my life, I had never really been on my own. The friendly taxi driver drove down so many backcountry roads, past pretty farms, little barns, flowering meadows, mountainous valleys, lakes and fields, filled with horses and cows. Nearly there, he said, glancing at me through the visor mirror. Nearly there. The taxi turned down a dirt road, where the dirt was siphoned up in the air, while the stones on the side of the road began pelting the car's undercarriage with pings and bangs. There goes my clean car, said the taxi driver, chuckling, as he drove down the precarious path towards the tiniest, really very charming wooden cabin, nestled in a pretty flowery meadow, surrounded by a backdrop of tall, imposing trees. Very charming, said the taxi driver. What a delightful cabin. Are you a writer by any chance? Actually, no, I'm not. Why do you ask? Well, it's only because it's often writers, poets and painters I tend to drop off in remote locations like this, where it's terribly beautiful. They always tell me places like this inspire the creative juices to flow. One lady, a famous writer I know, she had writer's block for over 2 years. Couldn't put a pen to paper. She came out to a cabin like this. Within a month she was well on her way to writing a bestseller. I must say if I stayed in a place like this, I would write a masterpiece myself."
"Oh, so you write as well?" I asked curiously.
"No, madam, I don't," said the taxi driver, giving me a big wink and taking my suitcase out of the trunk. "What I'm saying is that even the most uncreative people who can't string two words together are going to have more imagination in a place like this, surely."
"Maybe you're right," I said, glancing around at the stunning views. "The place is spectacular, dreamy, romantic."
"So why are you here, then?" asked the taxi driver, "if I may be so impertinent as to ask you. A young girl staying in a remote cabin like this? If you're not a writer, not an artist or a painter, my next guess is you're running away from something. Am I right, or am I right? Possibly an abusive partner. I'm guessing that by the nasty black eye of yours."
"You're right," I said. "You've hit the nail on the head there."
"Well, if you ask me, you're well rid, and this is a perfect place to hide out."
"Maybe, but I'm just concerned that I'll not cope with being alone in a place like this."
"You've never been alone before?" asked the taxi driver in surprise.
"No, I can't say I have."
"There's nothing like it. It's a treat to be with yourself, without a solitary soul in sight, you mark my words. As my wife says, solitude is very good for the soul. The trouble with our lives these days is we're all far too busy, way too hectic. So slowing down and connecting with nature is a very enriching experience indeed."
The taxi driver pulled out his card.
"The name's Dan. If you need to go shopping in Charleston for some shopping, give me a call. I'll give you mates' rates, I assure you."
"I will," I said. "Thanks, Dan." It was after Dan drove his taxi down the driveway. I now realised I was truly alone. I didn't feel apprehensive or nervous as I'd expected to. Instead, the idea of being on my own was actually growing on me, rather surprisingly. After the shock of realising the man I believed I loved was not whom he appeared to be. Maybe being on my own was the perfect way for me to heal. If nature could cure writer's block, then it could almost certainly heal my broken heart. I settled into the rustic cabin so seamlessly. I'd rented it out from a local farmer. He left me a note saying, "Welcome. We'll pop around to see how you're doing. Need anything, don't hesitate to call." The picturesque cabin was very basic, Arcadian, primitive and rudimentary, with a large fireplace, a king-sized bed, a settee, a bookcase, a small little kitchen area with a gas refrigerator, a cooker and a large wooden table with chairs. There was an outside outhouse and, of course, a water tank, along with several gas lamps, as there was no electricity in the cabin. I had learnt that the cabin was very old. I could almost certainly believe it. It looked rather like an old miner's cabin, but in its rustic simplicity it was incredibly charming. In the days and weeks that followed, I settled into my solitary life as seamlessly as a duck to water, which surprised me most of all. Sometimes I would take the occasional trip to Charleston to stock up on groceries and to get a decent hot shower there to freshen up. I have to say I was beginning to really enjoy this solo adventure. I felt as if I was flourishing inwardly in this remote location, rather like a plant you relocate in an unlikely spot in your yard, and it begins to take off when you least expected it to. When I rose early in the morning, the flowering meadow would often be full of deer and rabbit bounding around. The fauna and flora were breathtaking. The rear side of the cabin was heavily flanked by towering oaks, red budwoods, honey locusts and pine trees. There was a pretty little stream that meandered through the woodgrove, where the fast-moving water whacked its white foaming waves against a kaleidoscope of different colourful rocks. There was also a small little rocky embankment on the side of the stream, with hundreds of smooth rocks that jutted out of it, that became perfect chairs where you could sit over the water. It was ironic that the taxi driver had talked about writing, as I began to start writing poetry. My creative juices were inspired in such an idyllic, tranquil and natural environment. I would sit on one of those large, smooth rocks by the water. I would begin to write. Sometimes I was there for absolute ages, losing all track of time, as the day melted away all too quickly, like a fast-burning candle on its wick. I would take an early morning walk, moments after the sun rose over the valley into the woodgrove. There are no words to describe how transfixing this glorious place was, especially when it burst forth to life with the chirrups, tweets and warbles of birdsong. I'd often encounter random wild animals, like a stray fox, deers and squirrels. I loved how green and viridescent the forest was, how the towering majestic trees seemed to almost hug me with their convivial energy. I adored the way the soft shafts of sunlight danced through the open canopy, bespeckling the floor in a soft ethereal light. Some of those trees were so masterfully tall, I would practically have to crane my head just to see their leafy boughs. It was on the last week of my stay in the cabin that I began to notice a remarkable change in the ambience and vibrational atmosphere when I ventured out into the woods. I would set off early, armed with my thermos of coffee and my textbook and pencil in hand, upon which I would write down my poems. But on this particular occasion when I entered the woodgrove, something was different. There was a shift in the all-embracing vibe. It was then that I realised the woodgrove seemed to mute, as the birdsong dissipated like the smoke from a chimney. It became ominously still, although there was a gentle breeze blowing through the trees. Yet everything became so quiet that the sound of silence was a little disturbing. It did send prickles of apprehension down my spine. That was when I got the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I could feel eyes on me. But as I scanned the forest, I saw no sight or sound of anyone. I told myself I was being awfully silly, but then I felt it again, the eyes on me. "Is anyone out there?" I called out. "Is anyone there?" But I was met with the sound of silence. Then I was convinced I had seen a head peeking at me from behind a tree trunk, but when I went to investigate, the tree trunk, there was nothing there. I made my way to the stream and sat there watching the water. As I was sitting there, something began throwing little pebbles at me. "Is anyone out there?" I called again, but I was met with silence. I could swear I'd seen a head behind a branch, peeking at me. I kept reassuring myself that I must have been imagining things. That night I must have been woken up in the early hours of the morning at about 1 o'clock. I was awoken to the inauspicious, portentous sound of something heavy-footed and ponderous stomping around the cabin. Whatever it was, it sounded big. I sat bolt upright in bed with a start. It was the first time in my stay at the cabin that I began to feel seriously afraid. I could feel the hair prickling up at the back of my neck. Something was out there, but what? I grabbed the fire poker from the fireplace and proceeded towards the door of the cabin, putting my ear to the door. Oh my God, something was out on the wooden deck, but what? I could hear a thumping sound, and then the feet moved away and were thankfully gone. I began to breathe again. Relief washed over me like a cool, refreshing shower. I cautiously opened the front door. There on the outside table were 2 large, gleaming, freshly caught beautiful bass, along with an old ice cream container filled to the brim with big, sweet, juicy berries. That was when I discerned the farmer who was letting the cabin out to me must have dropped off these gifts. I had been told he might pop around, but in the middle of the night like this, scaring me half to death, was a bit unreasonable, wasn't it? Needless to say, he had redeemed himself, dropping off these fish for me, I thought. I remember my mother telling me that my grandfather used to thoroughly enjoy a spot of nighttime fishing. Perhaps the farmer engaged in a similar pastime, I thought. But didn't he realise or even conceive that a young woman alone in a cabin might just be a teensy-weensy bit intimidated and apprehensive and possibly threatened by strange thumping sounds outside the cabin at night? It would seem over the next 4 nights the same thing happened again and again. The farmer made a god-awful commotion, dropping off sea bass and berries for me every night. But by then, after hearing the strange sounds, I no longer felt afraid. I had left out the clean ice cream container on the wraparound porch. It was refilled every night with big, fat, juicy berries. I decided on the last night of my stay at the cabin that I seriously needed to personally thank the farmer for leaving me behind such generous fish every night. By all accounts, I'd been frying that fish on the gas hob in butter, parsley, lemon juice and garlic for supper. I've never tasted such buttery fish that melted in the mouth. Believe me, I frequented some of Boston's best seafood restaurants. This fish trumped anything I'd ever eaten there. I imagined the farmer must be a spectacular fisherman to procure such large prime specimens. Then there were those fat, juicy berries I ate every morning with yoghurt, and they were the juiciest berries I've ever eaten. I knew such bounteous magnanimity needed to be rewarded. Earlier on in the day I'd made a special trip to Charleston, where I'd brought the most delicious apple and raisin strudel from the most illustrious bakery there, along with strawberry cheesecake that looked like it belonged on the cover of a lifestyle magazine. I thought I'd give it to the farmer personally. I mean, it was the least I could do in the circumstances to say a special thank you to him for his kindness. That night I could hear the farmer thundering around my cabin. I had personally decided he must be a big strapping man. I quickly dashed out to the cabin door, pulled it open with the 2 bakery boxes tucked under my chin. "It's Farmer Andrews, am I right?" I said, seeing a vague silhouette standing in the doorway. As I walked out onto the porch with my headlamp on my head, I continued to talk. "Now I must thank you, Farmer Andrews, for the delicious fish," I said, holding the baker's boxes out to him with my hand. But as my squinting eyes gradually adjusted to the light, that was when I soon realised I wasn't looking at a farmer, but a Bigfoot. I knew at once it was a Bigfoot, as I had a friend who was obsessed with the creature, and had introduced me to the Patterson footage, challenging me to say that this creature wasn't real. I just gasped as I saw the Bigfoot, who was holding the fish out to me, looking at me with deep-set, bright, sparkling eyes. "Thank you," I said, reaching to take them from him, while I handed him my baker's boxes, which he took from me. For a moment I locked eyes with the creature. He was very different to the Patterson footage. His face was like that of a man, with a sloped forehead, high cheekbones, flat nose, and very deep-set, twinkling eyes. His entire body was covered with long, flowing, dark hair. He was incredibly big. When I say big, he was massive, easily 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, with ginormous shoulders. Not for a single moment did I feel dismay or foreboding, but I will tell you this, what I did feel was wondrous awe. I knew I was in the presence of a truly remarkable creature. The Bigfoot looked at me, and I heard the words in my head, "I like you, you really are pretty." I was thinking, did I really hear that? But I know the words in my head were not my own thoughts. Besides, I've never considered myself pretty, so I wouldn't even think that. He opened the baker's boxes and let out a huge, delighted whoop. He dipped his finger in the apple strudel, took a taste, and whooped again. I laughed because his expression was rapturous, as if I'd given him a cheque for $1 million. But when he tasted the strawberry cheesecake, let's just say the whoop went up several more syllables. He took another big bite. "Thank you so much for the fish," I said to him in English, "and the berries. They were wonderful." The creature nodded at me, and I swear he smiled. I watched him gliding away into the forest. He was carrying the baker's boxes with him, looking terribly pleased, glancing over his shoulder at me a couple of times. Then he was gone. The next morning when I awoke up, the farmer who'd rented me the cabin arrived on the scene to apologise profusely that he hadn't popped over to see me sooner, to ask me how I was doing. But his elderly mother had been poorly, so he'd been visiting her regularly in a nursing home. Suffice to say, when I returned home, I discovered that Rusty had been admitted to the psychiatric hospital for further treatment. He wouldn't be coming out of the place for another 6 months, so I need not have spent 2 months of solitude in a cabin. But I'm so glad I did, as in this transfixing, magnificent place, I found nirvana. I found the beauty of solitude, the joy of a butterfly darting over a flower, the pleasure of watching water crashing over the rocks, the majesty and grace of the tall imposing trees in the wood grove, a talent for writing poetry, and an anomalous encounter with a Bigfoot that might just have fancied me a wee little bit. Hence all the generous gifts he brought me daily, that I'm so glad I reciprocated. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, my name is Hilda, and I live in the heart of the Tennessee countryside, in a beautiful mountain home, on the edge of a rural dirt road that is both remote and well off the beaten track. My gorgeous Swiss-style wooden cabin is surrounded by beautiful rolling green valleys and ubiquitous trees that literally stretch out into vast areas of ongoing forest that seem to just spread out for eternity. I also have a couple of glorious ponds on my land that have been here for over 100 years and are a wonderful place for the deer to congregate, where they enjoy a cool drink on a hot summer's day. I am not married, but I live here alone with my 2 yellow Labradors called Tumbles and Twix, and they are the most faithful companions that you could ever ask for, especially when you live on your own. I do have 2 grown-up children now who live in Germany and have long since flown the nest, but we always keep in touch by using Skype on a regular basis, which I find wonderful. My children spent their childhood growing up here in the Tennessee mountain air, and they have the most wonderful recollections of their childhood here. One thing my children are unanimous about is their belief that something strange was going on in our woods for years. When my children were young, they always said that they saw sightings of strange orbs and heard disembodied voices that they would hear when they were playing in our yard. My youngest child claimed to have seen the hooded figures of monks chanting in the woods from time to time. At that time, I dismissed her claims as fanciful thinking, but now, all these years later, I wasn't so sure. Well, not anymore. It is inevitable that over the years, living in this part of the world, you get to hear the usual animal calls during the night, like crickets, frogs, coyotes and owls, and the occasional wolf. But there have also been times when I've heard other strange sounds that I just could not identify, like whooping sounds, wood knocking, and very strange screams that were so alarming it would leave my hair standing on end. One day, long after my children had flown the nest, I noticed other unexplainable sounds that came directly from the woods, and it sounded exactly like monks chanting, and it was so hard to explain. All I knew was that I would wake up in the middle of the night to hear this mysterious chanting, and it sounded eerily supernatural. I remember my younger child telling me of her visual sightings of these monks. Now the skeptic in me was beginning to wonder if there was more to her story than I had ever envisaged. I had always avoided walking in the woods for some unexplained reason. Perhaps on an unconscious level, I was intimidated by those forests, because it would seem that something oddly menacing, almost evil, was always watching me from those woods. It was on a bright summer's morning, when the sunlight filtered across the valley in streams of beautiful golden light, that I heard that mystical, esoteric monk music coming from the woods all over again. It was such a crystal clear kind of noise that you could be forgiven for believing that someone had actually set up a sound system in the clearing, and I found the music was drawing me into the woods with a seductive intrigue. So, armed with my rifle in my hands, I took Tumble and Twix in the woods for a walk. I did feel safe with them by my side. As I entered the wooded clearing, the deep chanting sounds became louder and louder and clearer and clearer. There was a gentle breeze blowing, and I saw this cloudy, smoky haze drifting past me, just like smoke, and it smelt exactly like frankincense and myrrh, and was surprisingly very uplifting. Suddenly I saw 2 hooded, cloaked figures wearing brown robes with rope sashes tied around their middles and leather thong sandals on their feet. These men looked exactly like monks, and I could not see their faces clearly, but I noticed the hands were clasped in prayer, and it seemed that they were in a deep meditative state. Yet all this time the mysterious chanting continued to fill the forest with a mystical, supernatural ambience, which was not of this world. But I will tell you this, it was enchantingly beautiful. As I drew closer to the monks, I watched them literally glide through the wall of a dense thicket and then vanish before my sight, just like a pair of ghosts. I was intrigued by what I'd seen, and the experience left me feeling serenely mellow. At the same time, I wondered if I'd really seen those monks, or whether my imagination was in some kind of magical overdrive. But smelling the lingering wafts of woody incense convinced me that what I had seen was indeed real. Both Tumbles and Twix were not afraid of these strange ghostly figures, but were actually wagging their tails furiously, like they would do in the presence of a lovely friend, and it was their ease and joyful countenance that encouraged me to proceed further into the woods with a fearless eagerness. I noticed that so many tree branches in the woods were twisted into strange angles, and it really did look as if it had been intentionally done, but I knew it would take a great deal of skill and a huge amount of strength to be able to manipulate and twist branches in such a way, especially without managing to break them. Then there were other branches that appeared to be purposely snapped. I also noticed trees that were turned upside down to expose the roots, and they looked so sinister and menacing, almost like a large blazing red sign saying, "Get out!" It was almost as if something or someone was marking their territory in a strange kind of mystical Morse code. Finally, I came across these strange teepee-looking structures, but they looked like statuesque markers of some kind, which had symbolic meaning behind them. So it really felt like the forest was ablaze with these odd symbols, which was a signing system I did not understand or comprehend. But I did get a very clear message from them, and it was, "Get out!" I did get also the sense of being an intruder in these woods and interrupting something that was not for my eyes to see. But I was curious, and it was with this eager enthusiasm to explore further that urged me to walk deeper into the heart of the forest. I finally came to an open clearing, and I noticed on the left there was a very large nest there, and that was strewn with layers upon layers of twigs, branches and hay, and it looked like something big was using the space as a sleeping area. But what kind of creature was resting there, I wondered? Whatever it was, it had to be huge, because the nest was massive. Strewn in the right-hand corner of the nest was a pile of animal carcasses of what the creature had been eating, and there were carcasses of hog, deer, squirrel, coon, and rabbit, piled up in a huge heap without discrimination. So whatever this predator was, he or she was eating well and eating almost anything and everything in sight. It was clearly still living here, because there was a half-eaten squirrel on the pile, still waiting to be devoured. My dog was not happy when he smelt the nest. Neither of them were. It was like they sensed that whatever this predator was, it was something that clearly terrified them. They were whimpering uneasily, and their tails were tucked in between their legs in submissive resignation. It was weird because everything in the forest suddenly became eerily quiet, and the only way I can describe it was as if someone turned all the background noises off, because there was no bird song anymore, and it became deathly still. I want to tell you that an experience like this is utterly unnerving, and I was determined to get out of this creepy, sinister forest as quickly and as fast as I could. I was about to turn around and go back to my cabin when I sensed these steely, evil eyes watching me, and it was the most terrifying feeling that I have ever experienced in my entire life. I really got the sense that a powerful predator was stalking me, and that I might be next on his dinner menu. It was amazing how I just sensed him there, even though I could not physically see him. Believe me, sometimes not seeing the threat face to face can be worse than actually seeing it, because you don't know what the impending threat actually is. You have no idea where it's coming from, or when it may just suddenly pounce out on you in surprise. Suddenly those terrible fears of mine were confirmed when I heard this low guttural growl that sounded more intimidating than the roar of a lion, and I found myself freezing up like a block of ice. Ah! I noticed that both my dogs were feeling it too, as they lay at my feet, seemingly paralyzed by an overwhelming fear. Ah! Ah! I could see some shrubbery moving towards my left, and the branches of a small tree swaying to and fro and backwards and forwards. I really felt that this thing, whatever it was, clearly wanted to scare me half to death, and it was working because I was filled with an overwhelming sense of impending dread. Suddenly I got the whiff of the most deplorable odour you could ever imagine smelling. It smelt like a decaying corpse. and once I had smelt a dead body in my life, and if anything could be worse than that smell, this was it. It was utterly foul and very sweet and sickly. Then I heard this thunderous sound that sounded exactly like a crash of thunder, and then bolting through a barrage of thorny, dense thicket like a huge bulldozer was the deadliest predator that I have ever seen in my entire life. A creature like the likes of such I have never seen before, and I hope to never see again as long as I live. This creature was a humanoid bipedal ape of about 10 feet tall and easily 1,100 pounds, and he was covered in thick, dense, short black hair with a large white ribbon-like stripe down his back. He had the most gargantuan shoulders with a huge, massive torso that made the rest of his body seem almost willowy by contrast. But I promise you, there was nothing small about this thing. He had long arms so typical of primates and slightly shorter legs that appeared strong and muscular. The head was elongated like a cone, and the grey-skinned face was graced with long white wispy beard. But this creature was otherwise hairless on the face, with a very big flat nose, deep-set eyes, a large thin mouth, and a very prominent brow ridge. Furious brown eyes regarded me with murderous rage, and he was seething, and the message was clear. He wanted me dead. I definitely sensed he was only interested in one thing, and that was adding me to the large pile of skeletal remains on his nesting area, along with his half-eaten squirrel. I stood there paralysed with fear, and so immobilised I simply could not manoeuvre my clumsy fingers to pull back the trigger. Believe me, I tried, because my life hung in the balance, but this creature had a powerful emotional and mental hold over me that was so incapacitating that I simply could not use my rifle. This hairy humanoid ape lunged towards me and grabbed my rifle, tossing it in the air in absolute disgust, and then he threw it across the forest floor, and I heard it crashing on the ground with a loud almighty thud. Now I was well and truly at the mercy of this thing, whatever on earth it was. It rarely looked like a creature you would expect to see only in your darkest nightmares. It was between me and him now, and I stood no chance against this hairy giant. My life flashed before my eyes, and I found myself wondering how long it would take for him to kill me. I was praying that my dying process would not hurt, because I knew that my life was finally over. There was no doubt about that in my mind, and it was so surprising because in those seconds I began to accept my horrifying fate, because it was a realm that was out of my control. Suddenly my dog Twix, who had always been protective of me, overcame his incredible fear for some unexplainable reason, and jumped up and nipped this creature very hard several times. And believe me, that was a bold thing to do to a predator like this. Suddenly the creature let out an immobilizing, furious roar, because my dog had dared to challenge him. I do not believe that anything had ever taken this creature on before, not even one of his own kind. He was a monstrous bully that always got his own way because of the terror that he would orchestrate among his victims. That I was certain of. My dog's bites clearly infuriated him. In an outburst of extreme rage, he grabbed Twix and was about to throttle him to death, and with a single blow of his mighty hands. But I could not stand back and watch this creature tear my precious dog apart. In that moment I screamed at the top of my lungs, "No! No! No! Please, no! You can't do that!" And then I courageously lunged towards the creature and poked my fingers and sharp long nails directly into both of its eyes, semi-blinding him in the process with a powerful force that even surprised me. I suppose that I knew I had nothing to lose. I might as well die fighting back as hard as I could. I believe my dogs had come to a very similar conclusion, because their fear had been taken over with an instinctive desire to fight back and to protect me as hard as they could. It seemed like their fear had magically dissipated. The creature let out a huge, pathetic whimpering sound, which seemed utterly ridiculous, coming from such an intimidating predator. He was clearly in pain, and he cradled his painful eyes in his massive cupped hands. In that second, my dogs and I wasted no time and ran away as fast as we could out of that forest. Suddenly I heard the sound of that chanting music, and I could smell that strange incense all over again. And in that moment, an overwhelming sense of peace and calm came over my entire body, and I noticed that even my dog's nature had transformed, and they were wagging their tails as if nothing had happened. I looked back into the forest, and that was when I saw two cloaked figures of the monks walking away and disappearing into the undergrowth. I knew something outer-worldly had happened in that forest, and as crazy as it may sound, I believe I was helped by those ghostly monks. They had been like guardian angels to me. I was certain of that. I just remember the incapacitating fear that paralyzed me so much, but suddenly it was like the trance-like hold that this hairy humanoid had over me was shattered like glass and replaced by an extreme desire to fight back, which not only miraculously affected me, but Twix and also the other dog, with a boldness that neither of us naturally possessed. I have no idea why I chose to aim for this creature's eyes, and even now I marvel at how I did this, because I literally disabled the creature for long enough to escape from those woods with both my life and the lives of my two devoted dogs still intact. After this incident, I did some research on my property, and I found that in the 1800s, the ground that I was living on was used as a retreat for monks, and during one of those retreats, two of the monks were killed on the land by a rogue mountain lion. It made me feel even more certain that these monks helped me because they had died in the hands of a predatory creature themselves, and so they rescued me from a very similar fate. I told my children in Germany what had happened, and my young girl told me that she had seen those two monks in the forest on several occasions before. She had also smelt the incense and heard the mystical, intriguing chanting. She said that she had always felt that those monks were loving, spiritual, godly men. She reminded me of the dreadfully sad time when Panda, our black and white tabby, had gone missing for 2 whole weeks. I prayed so hard for Panda to return home safely, Mum, she said. And then I remembered those ghost-like monks in the woods, and I knew they were godly men. And so I asked them to help me to find Panda. I didn't think that anything would actually happen, but 5 minutes later, Panda appeared in the kitchen, meowing for something to eat. It was then, Mum, she told me, I knew that those monks had helped me, and I believe they helped you too, by enabling you to escape from that dangerous creature, by giving you supernatural courage and strength, as well as the 2 dogs of ours. For a long time I could not put a name to that strange creature that I'd seen in the forest that day, but now I believe he fits the profile of being a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, or a hairy man. I still sometimes hear that strange esoteric music on our land. I do not think the monks are trapped here at all, but I think they come and visit us from time to time, the place that was once a retreat to them, and also because it was the place where they encountered that deadly mountain lion. I believe they do revisit me from time to time, and I can hear them with their music filtering across the valley.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.